River People for Thompson Highway and Raymond Lalonde. I have come now to live with the river people. I was raised among the earth people, proud, dirt under the fingernails, long, rugged, silent days of hoeing and plowing. Electric barbed wire to keep the cows in, tin granaries bulging with ripe wheat. Bright orange carrots rooted improbably, juicy, green feather topped in cracked black soil. Meadowlarks perched on the fence posts along the gravel road, announcing the morning with their cheery, trilling song.
Thanks for having us here today. I'm definitely excited to see all the inspiring ideas that come out of the next 2 days. I think it's fantastic to have everyone involved. Just a quick thing: is everybody able to see the presentation slide that's up right now? Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So as Michaela mentioned, my name is Kevin Handkamer. I am a landscape planner within the campus planning office. As part of this project, we had some researchers involved, and that was Jordan and Nathan. And Jordan's joining us here today, which is fantastic.
Hi, everybody.
So I can give a brief overview of this document. So the process of creating the document began with the desire to bring a deeper understanding to the history of these lands in which the campus is situated. Through the planning and design work in which we are involved with, discussions of campus history have typically only acknowledged the colonial context of the site. And as a prairie landscape outside of the city of Winnipeg, where the first agricultural college was constructed, this document will be a tool to help broaden the understanding of the campus lands and will be provided to individuals involved in the planning, design, and development of the campus. So in applying this information to landscape and planning and design is to reflect and emphasize the Indigenous and environmental histories of the land on which the campus sits, making them visible and significant components of the campus environment and recognizing them as a crucial part of the campus's culture, heritage, and identity. This report supports, oops, sorry here, I'm just gonna hide my Zoom. This report supports the university's strategic priority of creating pathways to Indigenous achievement, specifically the goal to weave Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditions into the fabric of our university. It also exists alongside the university's Indigenous planning and design principles and the Visionary Generation Master Plan for the Fort Garry Campus. And while this document is meant to help indigenize the campus by reflecting pre-colonial landscapes and histories, much of the historical material consulted is from colonial sources. This report acknowledges this tension and seeks to balance the origins of these sources by relying also on Indigenous scholarship and research, as well as knowledge communicated in several traditional knowledge reports. This report is not exhaustive or authoritative. It represents a starting point based on research conducted for this specific project. The Indigenous histories of the campus region are numerous and complex. This report reflects only a fraction of that complexity. So just going into the geographical scope and history. In the context of Treaty 1 territory, the groups most historically present within the region are the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Métis people. The university community, however, includes Indigenous peoples from many regions and treaty territories far beyond the geographic scope of this research. The present-day campus was also situated within what came to be known as the Red River Settlement, where Métis identity flourished into a new distinct culture. The campus is also located within the area of the Peguis-Selkirk Treaty. Reflecting on the land area of this treaty gives new perspectives on the Fort Garry campus's place along the Red River, situating it within an expansive area that stretched along the Red River from Lake Winnipeg into what is now North Dakota. It also gives perspective on the campus lands as existing within a long and deep history of relationships between people and with the land. This report aims to help situate the campus lands as being a part of a geographical area with rich environmental heritage, as well as a deep network of First Nations and Métis histories that extend to the present day. Archaeologist analysis of the river bottom forest just south of the university has shown First Nations use and occupancy as far back as 2,000 years. Pictured here is the Fort Garry campus within the context of the Peguis-Selkirk Treaty. The Dutamog or totemic markers used by First Nation chiefs to sign the treaties did not just represent signatures, they also signified the nature and character of the land to which later the settlers would arrive and the importance of relationships within the territory. The Fort Garry campus is often referred to as a suburban commuter campus near the southern edge of Winnipeg. The perception that we see in historical images of the university is that the agricultural campus was constructed in the vast prairie outside the metropolitan area. It's often easy to think of the pre-development landscape of the campus lands as untouched and empty. This perception of the land as unoccupied or unutilized is embedded in colonial thinking and is not reflective of the historical reality of the area. In fact, the ways in which Indigenous peoples utilized and occupied the area demonstrated diverse and complex ways of life that were intrinsically tied to the land, water, and animals of the region, and based in deep traditional knowledge. So this is one of the images often thought of when discussing U of M history. So that's the image of wheat fields blowing in front of the administration building in a typical agricultural setting. However, a little bit of a deeper dive shows that this was not the reality of the land until the establishment of the university in this location. So this is the clearing of the administration building. We have an image of the dense forest that existed. This is clearing of the land for the Taché Hall. And in the slide, you can see the dense forest in the background.
If I could jump in, Kevin, just really quickly. So I'm just going to be sort of talking a little bit about my experience while I was researching, some of the things that I learned, what I thought was surprising, or what I found valuable, specifically from a student perspective. So I really like these pictures because they show a campus that is almost totally unrecognizable. So there was dense forest, and that's probably not what most of us think when we imagine what it looked like, the land looked like prior to the 20th century. So I learned that much of the forest that existed prior to the Red River settlement was lost due to deforestation and agriculture. So undisturbed examples of river bottom forests are extremely rare today. There is one in southern Manitoba, and it can teach us a lot about what the forest in the Oxbow would have looked like prior to European settlement. I think the intentionality behind incorporating native greenery in the Eastern Transportation Corridor and future campus development is an important step towards revitalizing the vegetation that was historically removed from campus. And I also think that highlighting why specific species incorporated into these new green spaces could be a really good way to engage the campus community and invite them to learn more about that history.
So next we'll go into the interactions with the land. So prior to the arrival of European settlers, the landscape was regulated not only by seasons and weather, but also by First Nations people through controlled burns, resource harvesting, and agriculture. Controlled burns were employed to manipulate the behavior of bison, so to attract them in the spring and deter in the summer and fall. This helped to maintain the prairie condition, which would have been invaded by aspen if left undisturbed. So on the right side, you can see this graphic of the progression of a prairie landscape. So you start with open tall grass prairie, wet meadow, marshlands, trembling aspen start to invade into the territory, and then it becomes a mixed forest with bur oak and other species over time. So with controlled burns, it would help to maintain the prairie landscape. Cree Dakota people relied heavily on the bison, as did the Anishinaabe, who would often join the Great Métis bison hunt in the years following European contact. For the Métis, the bison hunt, along with the river lot system of dividing land, were the two most powerful tools in forging their national and class consciousness before 1850. Larger hunts comprised of hundreds of people could last for months and required a highly organized system of roles and responsibilities. The ability to organize en masse meant that the Métis hunters were highly adept when it came to defending their land rights in the Red River Resistance, establishing a provincial government in 1869 and securing the Métis Bill of Rights during the Manitoba's entry into Confederation. Farming has always been integral to the identity of Southern Manitoba, and the U of M holds a key place in the formation of this identity. Its location in Fort Garry began with the establishment of an agricultural college, and agriculture has retained a strong emphasis within the university's research and teaching, and within its identity overall, as we can see just east of the Eastern Transportation Corridor in the Point Lands. At the time of settlement, colonizers were often exceedingly frustrated with what they believed was First Nations resistance to take up permanent residences and work the land. At least 400 years prior to the Red River settlement, various First Nations groups were cultivating crops. Agriculture was an important pre-colonial activity and relied on a rich and complex understanding of environmental patterns and sustainability. Crops such as wild rice were an important local resource, and seeds were sown into marshes and small lakes along the Red and Assiniboine River corridors. Agriculture also played a prominent role in the social structure of the Red River Métis. The Métis farmer-trader communities were predominantly located in St. Boniface, St. Vital, and St. Norbert in the area of the present-day campus. Recognition of Indigenous forms of agriculture and their importance to the land and region of the campus could potentially expand and deepen the campus's agriculture identity beyond only European-based agriculture by exploring ways to communicate this broader identity through the planning and design of our campus. Movement and transportation. The Red River, while a key geographic feature of the campus, is also a living reminder of its historical importance to Indigenous peoples in the area and their connection through water to a vast network of other areas and peoples. The river was an important transportation and trade route and part of an Indigenous trade network stretching as far as the Gulf of Mexico and Hudson's Bay. The LaSalle and Red River Junction, just to the south of campus, was likely a significant site for meeting and trading, as of course was the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers at the Forks. Many settlers who arrived at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers traveled along trails that had been long established and utilized by First Nations peoples. Many of these trails were used by settlers and Métis cart traders during the fur trade era, and a number of Manitoba's present-day roads loosely follow them today. Although this network of trails was extensive, two trails in particular were most proximal to the present-day campus: the Pembina Trail, or West Red River Trail, and the Crow Wing Trail, consisting of both the East Red River Trail and the Woods Trail. The Pembina Trail extended north and south along the western edge of the campus and was the precursor to today's Pembina Highway. The Pembina Trail ran alongside the west bank of the Red River south to Lake Traverse in Minnesota and was a prominent route used by the Métis cart drivers. This trail initially enabled the Red River settlement to trade with Fort Pembina before the trail was extended down to St. Paul, Minnesota. To the east of the campus across the river was the Crow Wing Trail, consisting of both the East Red River Trail and the Woods Trail, which was in the vicinity of where St. Mary's Road currently lies. The Crow Wing Trail originated near the Forks and utilized former beach ridges left over from glacial Lake Agassiz.
So I'm going to jump in again. I'm a bit biased in terms of how working on this project affected me. So I was living just outside of St. Adolphe while doing this research. So it felt like everything that I was learning was contextualizing and redefining my surroundings. So from getting to campus, being on campus, to where I lived. To this point, I would say the relationship between the cart trails that Kevin mentioned and our current highways was one of the most surprising and impactful things that I learned about. This to me represents an intimate living connection to the history of the First Nations trails and the Métis cart trails that were integral before and during the fur trade era. So to get into the city from St. Adolphe, I had to take Highway 75, which loosely follows what was once the Pembina Trail, or St. Mary's Road, which loosely follows what was once the Crow Wing Trail. So St. Adolphe is only about 25 minutes south of the campus, but once I started imagining what it must have been like to make that trip on a Red River cart and how long that must have taken, the landscape that I was so familiar driving through completely changed. I feel like this temporal shift made me realize just how vast the landscape is, and by extension, how valuable these trails were for their ability to connect people and facilitate trade all the way down to St. Paul. So traveling to and from campus became meaningful to me because it felt like my daily commute, which was normally mundane, was now reminiscent of historically and culturally important movement.
And so other trails in the vicinity of the Wallace Building and just south of campus near Kings Drive were noted in 1874 survey drawings that highlighting the river lots on present-day campus. So, you know, oftentimes we think of the campus kind of existing in an area that was outside of everything, but in reality was kind of in the heart of things at the time. So I think with the remnants of these cart trails could present an opportunity for you know, future exploration or representation in some way in campus planning and design. So here we see an 1858 woodcut that's showing a glimpse of the Point Lands, which is looking south from lot 61 in the St. Vital parish. And the sketch, you can see one of the buildings that would have existed on the Point Lands. Along the Pembina Trail, the nearby Red River would have been a significant presence for the cart drivers, especially its many points and bends. It can be reasonably assumed that the Point Lands Oxbow of the campus could have been, at the very least, a notable landmark within the landscape. A feature we hardly notice today, the points or bends of the meandering river loomed as large in the consciousness of ox cart drivers as do the points of the shoreline to canoeists on a rugged northern lake. From present-day South Dakota and Minnesota to Manitoba, the Red River's curves were dotted with the names of people and events of the years of traveling along it. This example of Métis navigation of the landscape through significant and meaningful landmarks stands in contrast to numerous accounts of early European explorers and colonists. These accounts often describe the region of the present-day campus as a vast expanse of nothingness, with an apparently featureless landscape that was often seen by the inexperienced eye as a sea of prairie, as ominous as it was serene. This colonial view of the land did not acknowledge that, in fact, the landscape was inhabited, experienced, understood, and traversed in complex and culturally meaningful ways by Indigenous peoples.
To add, a key aspect of land-based knowledge or oral geography is toponymy or place naming, which has a multitude of functions ranging from informing identity to social spatial reproduction. So place naming helps us navigate physical space, like identifying a specific bow in the river, and it also helps us form communities which we feel reflected by and a part of. So while researching, I learned that a number of communities that we're familiar with today, like St. Adolphe, used to be notable Métis settlements that went by different names. So La Pointe-Coupée was renamed St. Adolphe in the late 1860s. Rivière-au-Rat was renamed St. Pierre and later St. Pierre-Joly. So one of our sources on the subject, Etienne Rivard, says that, quote, in a sense, these church names erased, at least symbolically, the Métis presence, end quote. As we brainstorm and think of ways to design our physical campus spaces, I think it's vital that we keep in mind how powerful language and the act of naming is for creating inclusive communities.
So the campus river lots. The river lot system was implemented along the Red and Assiniboine rivers, where property was divided into narrow lots that extended 2 miles back from the bank of either river. Later, an inner and outer 2-mile system was implemented, where the inner 2 miles included the house, barn, or stable and gardens. The outer 2 miles were part of the hay privilege, containing long grass which could be cut for animal feed. The lots were highly practical, allowing everyone access to both the river and the prairie, ensuring that no farm families were isolated from neighborly social contact and support. Often a footpath would follow the riverbank, crossing the river lots and winding from farm to farm from the length of the parish, which I think in the 1874 drawings, which we can see faintly at the bottom, just south of campus, would be these river paths that would have came in the inner 2 miles. So maps of the campus area from the 1870s show that a cleared section of land extending across the property lines of the 5 river lots in the Oxbow where the point lands are currently. This suggests that the respective owners of these lots may have been collaboratively harvesting to maximize their returns during the peak growing season. Houses and barns within the point lands were constructed near the banks of the Red River and looked to have been between 1 and 1.5 miles away from the main Pembina Cart Trail. The cart trail itself passed through the area that is now Smart Park, not far from where the Pembina Highway is now. River lots and the resistance. The hay privilege portion of the outer edges of the river lots was a landholding feature not known to exist anywhere else in North America, the British Isles, or Europe, and it reflected the overlapping rights and claims of ownership that existed in the settlements region. Similar to the buffalo hunt, the hay privilege was governed by a system of rules and regulations to ensure it functioned smoothly for the groups using it. This included a simultaneous respect of First Nations land title, Hudson's Bay Company proprietary authority, and rights to individually held farm properties. This hay privilege component of the river lot was so important that it played a role in initiating the Métis Red River resistance. The initial spark occurred about 2 miles west of where the campus now sits, around River Lot 12. It was here where a Dominion land survey crew, marking out sections of the land to facilitate incoming settlers, trespassed on the hay privilege portion of the existing river lot. A party of 17 men, including Louis Riel, confronted the surveyors, asserting their rights to the land and forcing the crew to stop their survey work. This action, just west of the present-day Waverly West neighborhood, set into motion the Métis Provisional Government, the Resistance, and the eventual Manitoba Act.
I was really surprised to learn a couple of things that we talked about on these slides. How, first of all, the means of access to the campus lands transformed and even reversed the layout of the campus in the time that the university has existed. So before, when the river was the main avenue of transportation, people were concentrated along the riverbank with dense forest stretching out behind towards the Pembina Cart Trail. Now, most of the university community has almost no access to the riverbank or the point lands because we have Pembina Highway. So as a student, I was always very interested in the point lands purely because I didn't have access to them. So I'm really excited to see how future development could potentially change that. And then speaking to another point, Louis Riel is such a well-known historical figure, specifically in Manitoba. So finding out just how close to the campus grounds he and the other men were when they confronted the surveyors was really meaningful. This knowledge helped me tangibly place Riel in history, and that made him and his resistance to the Dominion land surveys that much more impactful.
So relationships, reconciliation, and campus design. The centrality of relationships is clearly a strong theme throughout the history of the Fort Garry campus lands and region, as is the importance of reciprocity and of continually maintaining those relationships. Many stories within Métis oral culture taught that people had to observe all the protocols, never forgetting that there is always reciprocity, meaning that you give an offering to receive an offering. Part of the Anishinaabe creation story also highlights the importance of reciprocity in relationships. These examples provide some insight into possible considerations for campus planning and design projects, but also in the process of campus planning and design. Borrowing from Nigan Sinclair, he gives the example of the signing of the 1817 Peguis-Selkirk Treaty as direction in relation to cross-cultural planning and design work. The Dutamag, or totemic markers used by First Nations chiefs to sign the treaty, signified the nature and character of the land to which the settlers had arrived and the importance of relationships within the territory. Put another way, the settlers were being invited into a mutual relationship to become family members, relatives, amongst a network of humans, animals, water, and land along the Red River. Part of the chief's stipulations within the treaty was for the settlers to provide them with 100 pounds of tobacco annually, which is difficult to grow in Manitoba and requires time and effort to produce. What the chiefs were really asking for then was a tangible gift of the settlers' time and commitment to put in the work of maintaining the ongoing relationships present by the treaty. The lessons of this treaty are echoed in the University of Manitoba's Indigenous planning and design principles, the first of which is commit to relationships and listening. Engaging campus planning and design project in the spirit of reciprocity described in a way that truly establishes and maintains relationships on campus. Thank you.
So I'm just gonna finish up with some of my thoughts. So in 2017, just make sure, yeah. In 2017, before I was a part of this project, I was in my 5th and final year of an honors English degree, so I'm an alumni now. I happened to come across the University of Manitoba's Visionary Regeneration Master Plan while researching for a class project. Announced in 2016, the plan emphasizes the importance of community, the environment, and sustainability, and presents open, walkable spaces as integral to this vision. So the following is a quote from page 13 of the plan. Quote, building on these notable open spaces provides opportunities to create a campus in a green setting, to represent the Indigenous footprint, both in design and function, where Indigenous traditions, principles, and cultures are woven into the fabric of the campus. So in truth, up until I came across this plan, I had given very little thought to the physical spaces and places that make up the campus. I was so focused on getting to class on time that I forgot to take meaningful notice of the institution that I was navigating on a daily basis. The Visionary Regeneration Master Plan changed my perspective. It made me realize that the physical campus, the buildings, greenery, and the pathways, is not only as much a part of the university community as you and I, but that it is filled with potential. And with historically informed collaborative planning, these spaces can become ones dedicated to the remembering and imagining of more inclusive communities. Having had the opportunity to be involved in creating the cultural landscape document was invaluable. It changed the way I understood myself as a settler student in an institution with a long and complex pre-colonial and colonial history. It changed the way I quantified past and future time. So for example, only 27 years separate the 1885 Northwest Resistance and the 1912 opening of the Fort Garry Campus. At the time it was published, the Visionary Regeneration Master Plan announced it would inform the next 30 years of campus development. I think this comparison is extremely useful and it puts into perspective how quickly things are capable of changing. In learning about the many historical events and activities that took place in and around the land where the campus now sits, this project also taught me that how we design our environment reflects who and what we prioritize, and that this remains evident throughout history. Our current values will be reflected in the structures and spaces that we create now for the University of Manitoba community's generations to come. I hope that the people involved in the creation of our collective futures on campus find the cultural landscape document to be an informative reference insofar as design and planning go. But I also hope that it offers other students, faculty, staff, and visitors a different perspective, one that inspires them to learn more about the history of the place that we're all a part of. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just move right into my, I think I only have 15 minutes, so I'll just hop right into my presentation. I got a number of slides, but I'll try and take my time on the key slides. Okay, next, slide, next slide. Okay, the presentation components that I set out was, there's the way the Cree worldview was explained to me with water as being a building block of life. I'll state that, and then the medicine wheel, human function within the medicine wheel, timeline and creation, and indigenous existence, spiritual connections between water and human existence, the Indian culture as an example of the importance of water, some conclusions relevant to the Eastern Travel Corridor, and a question for the, I'll just end with a question for the Eastern Travel Corridor Initiative. Okay, next. The medicine wheel, like if you look at it, it's the basic medicine wheel, what I call the basic medicine wheel, which I use as my theoretical framework. Around in the center is the creator, Kisemantu. In our language, we say Mantu or Kisemantu. And to the east, we have in a circle. We think in a circular way, and with those, the way we relate to the earth, east, south, west, north. And to the east, we have the spiritual realm. That's that's kind of correlated with the baby as we come into this world, and we possess the spirit. And then the physical, which is correlated with the child. As a child, we do a lot of physical growth. And then as the emotional quadrant, we have the adult. Which, as we grow into adults, we start to master our emotional beings. And then the mental, of course, we move into adulthood after our adulthood is coming to an end. So that's pretty well the cycle of life and the medicine wheel. But I'll explain the relevance of it. And this is a teaching, this one here, the conceptual framework. This is a teaching that I was taught from Dakota Elder at the Indigenous Student Center. He said the way we function is we feel an emotion, and then we think about it, emotion from the heart. And then we think about it with our minds, and then we act on that emotion and that thinking with our bodies, our physical bodies, and that becomes our experience with our spiritual beings. And I traced it out in that the way the medicine wheel was taught to me and the components. And as you can see, it forms the infinity sign, and I believe that's how we function, and that's the motor that drives us every day in everything that we do. So that became my conceptual framework. Okay, next. And in our culture, when we say eski, that one simple word, it includes everything in the world. Trees, fish, birds, animals, rocks, water, landforms, everything. Air, water, grass, and so on. Eski is a holistic word. It's inclusive of all living and non-living things, everything that's in the earth, everything that's formed by air, water, earth, and fire, in no particular order of importance, but they relate to each other in different ways and according to the grand design of the creator, the Semantu. Okay, next. And the timeline of creation and existence, we have in the eastern side, we have the geologic time, which is the age of the earth. And then we impose our own human way of recording that time with the Gregorian calendar, which is the history and the colonialism as you move south. And then as you move south, we talk about, today we talk about reconciliation, We're trying to address colonial impacts, including water. But what we're trying to achieve is what everybody tries to achieve in this life, and that's the good life. We say Minuk Matsun in our language, and that's at some point in the future. Okay, next slide. And this is a very interesting diagram that I came up with. I was trying to figure out how do I convey this, that with the creator, our relationship with the creator, and the relationship with creation, our relationship with creation, or our place in creation, because we ourselves are creation as well. And this is the diagram that I came up with. And I went and sat by the water to come up with this diagram. Like I went to Fort White and I sat by the water, probably about 20 minutes to half an hour maybe. And this is what came to me. In the spiritual realm, or the spiritual world of our world, we have on to the east, Manitou is the creator and grants, the one that grants life. And Nipi as creation is sacred. And as you move south, you have the physical world. And we are given a responsibility to take care of ASCII, the earth. And the Innu responsibility to take care of the water is through governance. That's the power that we have. And then as we move west, we have like, how do we take care of the earth? Well, we are stewards with our stewardship of ASCII and creation. And the water, as part of creation, enables the maintenance of ASCII and creation itself. And that's the ecosystem world. And as we move north, we move into the human world. And that is the in our terms, the Matsun, that's survival, and Minuk Matsun, the good life, what we're striving for. That's Innu. And water enables the health and well-being of the Innu. So all four quadrants have a water component to it. And this is kind of like the four parts to us if you correlate it to our relationships to water and creation. Okay, next slide. And if you look at like yourself as an individual, and then you project yourself to, your culture and your people. In my world, like the world of the Innu, this is basically what we've gone through. At the time of contact, like which maybe spanned 200 years, when we make contact with the European culture, we've seen a steady decline of our autonomy and our governance power. And one of the things that was asked of me when I did my dissertation is, how did we lose control? Like how and when did we lose control? And that was through a steady process of genocide, cultural genocide that's been accepted by the government of Canada, residential schools, Indian Act, treaties, history and language erosion. And that's been done through, unilateral interpretation of all these things. And where we're at right now is at the bottom there. And if the prediction is that if we don't change anything and we stick with the status quo, we're going to continue this decline. But where we're fighting to get to is that level of sovereignty that we had at the time of contact. And we need to do things like, hold Canada accountable. This colonial country called Canada, we need to hold them accountable for all the things that have been done through cultural genocide. And we need to take control of our rights and hold the government to its responsibilities, their legal responsibilities through treaties. And, there's been many as well, like the Royal Commission report. Now we have TRC, missing and murdered women. the government knows what they need to do, but they're just not willing to do it. So that's where we're trying to strive for that level of sovereignty that we had at the time of contact in a modern world. Okay. And this one is just a model that I came up with, like under self-government. And that is all the things that we would do, like if we were self-governing and able to do these things. We would do planning, we would do community water systems, we would do traditional territorial water stewardship. And then of course we would incorporate that into how we govern ourselves. So that's basically the model that I came up with in my dissertation. Okay, next. And part of my dissertation, I did paddle from God's Lake to Honoure House Cree Nation, following an ancestral route that our people used. So I've seen that our territory and the territories of other First Nations, I've paddled through that the boreal forest and got to see the water in its natural state. This is a very pristine area until you start to get into the Nelson River, where you have hydroelectric development. And this is a picture, like I just wanted to give a human face to our relationship with water. This is my paddling team. We would reach Honoure House after this picture was taken. These are my paddling partners. Next. And here we're heading back to God's Lake. We're about a quarter of the way back to God's Lake. And we're just stopping to rest here in just to take a rest. Okay, next. And I just wanted to give, like I said, sometimes we forget the human face to what all these issues that we talk about. And I just wanted to give an example of the role of water that plays in, culture, pretty well all cultures, but in my culture, which has been kind of oppressed and suppressed over hundreds of years. Here we have commercial fishing by my forefathers. Okay, next. Spiritual and religious life. This is the old United Church in God's Lake. As you can see, lots of people attended church back then. And this is right beside the lake. Okay, next. Living on the land, again, these cabins are situated usually right by the shorelines. Next. Freighting, of course, the one on the left is on the water, the old canvas wood boats. And then, of course, you got the tractor train over the ice. Okay, next. Travel, of course, you had dog teams, you had canoeing and traveling by boat on the lake. Okay, next. And then you had sports tourism, seasonal employment, guiding. That's a sport fishing tourist lodge there. I used to guide there as well as a young man. Okay, next. And then of course you have, our spiritual life too. Our graves are very sacred to us because of our spiritual beliefs. So we did record those as well. Okay, next. And I just wanted to share some conclusions about the conclusions that I drew from my dissertation. One of them was that, before the coming of the Europeans to North America, into our areas, or even to North America, it was the Indigenous people that kept this continent in a pristine state for thousands of years prior to the coming of the European people. And that's never been acknowledged. It's never been said, these people did a good job. They maintained this continent. And now we have Canada, which is only about 150 years, and with the fur trade, it's only over 200 years. And then they have they have kind of impacted the land quite a bit. And then we have also, like, they've kind of put us aside from our land. They've taken us out of our land and placed us onto reserves. Okay, next. Water is also very connected to the health of the people. And that is a very strong thing that I have to try and hit home, or everybody has to realize that water is health in so many ways, not just for your physical health, but your spiritual health, your mental health, your spiritual, like all those things that make up the person's health, those four quadrants, your spiritual, your physical, your emotional, and your mental. That is all tied to water, the health of the water. Okay, next. Water spirit. There's a spirituality. There's a spirit to water. Like that is our beliefs. And there's something that we all do every morning that gives us a very good sense of, well-being. And that's you wash your hands, right? Or you jump in the shower. That you might not be conscious of it, but that feeling comes from water. That good feeling that you have every day. Okay. And I was just wondering, I had a question like that. Now, this question came to me as I was preparing this presentation. Given the vital role of water to human existence, is there a way to incorporate water into the Eastern Transportation Corridor Initiative, even if it's a vision for the future? Like if you look at Assiniboine Park, Assiniboine Park, you have the Leo Mole Garden. You see all those, those fountains in there? Water's incorporated into that Leo Mole Garden. And also, if you look at, like I visited Trent University, I think that's the one that's in Peterborough. They have a bridge that goes across the river, the Manitoba, I forget the name of that river, but it goes across that river. And I was talking to an alumni one time, and I said, you know what, there's talk about building a bridge from the U of M campus to the other side, towards the St. Fidel side of the river. And she said, oh, that's been talked about for 50 years now, But is there a way that we can incorporate water, even in a future vision of what the Transportation Corridor Initiative will be? And that's a question that came as I was preparing this. Okay, and I think that's my presentation, and I'll hand it over to Shirley.
Thank you so much, Stewart. That was lovely. And I hope I am complimentary to that. I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, and just to, I worked with this with Craig Blacksmith, and he really felt, that this is the homeland of the Anishinaabe. It's not territory, that we don't have territory, that it's very important to see all the people and how they are sharing, and to identify that. But also the role of water, how the hydroelectricity is powering my computer and yours right now if you're here in Winnipeg. And it's coming from northern Manitoba, which is home to Stewart's area. God's Lake isn't impacted by dams so much, but most other communities are. It's only the Hayes River that isn't impacted by hydro and dams. So in all of Manitoba, all the watersheds are being impacted by hydroelectricity, and we have to acknowledge that, and how it impacts Native people most. The water in Winnipeg comes from Shoal Lake, adjacent to Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, who have struggled to have drinking water access and have used bottled water for years, and for Freedom Road, which they just fought hard for and got. And I acknowledge the damage of the past and present, committing to work in meaningful partnership with Native peoples. And with that comes the map that shows how Native people used the land and were broadly, you can see Cree, Algonquin, Stewart, Dakota. Dakota didn't sign treaties, and they're considered, wrongly, according to this map, and which is the Hudson's Bay Company, which is the tract that they were very much present in Canada. And this brings us here to U of M, right? You recognize this, and we're surrounded by water. We're absolutely surrounded by water, and you would never know it coming to the university. It's really in the backdrop, and as was mentioned, there's few vistas to really see, but also to experience the importance of actually being in communion, right, with the water. So how can we look at that differently and see it? And I think that would create such a spiritual force and change the thinking at the university from colonial to anti-colonial to decolonize, right? We have to decolonize our thinking, and part of that is the landscape. So from these diagrams, where's the water, right? We see none of it. How do you experience water? As a result, are you in communion? Do you think of water? Do you see yourself as part of a water landscape? All life comes from water. We couldn't have life without water. So that becomes very important. And what Stewart spoke about is water being considered as sacred. And how can we see that and bring that into design? And should water be, be seen as sacred in design? So considering that water through swales, through different things can be on this land. So in a drought period, we have luscious land, we have luscious life and deposits, but as well seeing the river system around it and knowing the role that it played. And as was mentioned earlier, this is from the video that was shown earlier, is there are some pathways, I guess, on the other side that are being created around water, but you can see, I think there's no way to access water. So how do you make it more accessible so that you can have better communion with it? And let's consider, in different places, rivers have been given personhood, and thinking of water, rivers, creeks as alive, as life, but as our relations, which is something I think I'm learning a lot about. And, there is this water declaration as a way, and maybe something that could be part of the design is considering the importance of water and its rights and our obligation to protect water. And that's what it says. We forbid any future development, but our obligation to protect our water and everything that water touches and gives life to, including the land, animals, air, plants, and humankind. I wanted also to refer to Land Back. This is called the red paper. And the one thing I was noting is most of the visuals have water in it. And it shows the aspect of water, how important water is to land. And, water is ASCII as well as land. So the first step was the spectrum of consent. So it's realizing past harms, that there has been coercion, that the Crown land, 89% is considered federal and provincial, which we have to really look at free, prior, and informed consent and the right holders. And the denial that's happened. And here is a quote from Fox Lakes Cree Nation. The revival of our culture, our language, and tradition is so important to our healing. And these were things that the hydro development took away from us. I know it may seem hard to understand and make the connection of hydro take took this away. But if you sit with us and listen with your hearts, the stories of our people's homes being bulldozed to make way for hydro, the sexual assault of our women carried out by the workers, the violence and the crime left 18 years undocumented, you will understand. And this is still occurring right now. It's a pivotal time. Merle Ballard, Dr. Merle Ballard, has been a champion looking at her nation, Lake St. Martin, and the impact of the channel. There was an emergency channel during the 2011 flood, and it resulted in 7-8 years of displacement of her community. And on the table again is another channel. So that channel was not, had problems, right? They didn't do an environmental assessment. They're doing an impact assessment now, or actually they're doing an environmental assessment because it falls under the other, the previous legislation. And see the big channels that are being created to divert water from the Assiniboine system to entirely different systems to protect Winnipeg. So it plays a role in our lives in Winnipeg. We're all connected, and we can see how much the wetland drainage has contributed to that. All the blue areas where there's very few blue areas, there's lots of wetland loss. So that increases the intensity and severity of floods and droughts. And it realizing these are homes to plants, animals, and fish, which, you know, are our relations. And how this is increasing. The diversions have been increasing over time, and resulted in 5 million cubic meters diverted in 2011. So here you see the Lake Manitoba watershed and the Assiniboine River watershed, and how they're connected, and how they're two entirely separate watersheds. But through this diversion, it takes water from one and puts it in another. So now we're at reclamation, and this was covered, or reconciliation. This land back refers to it as reclamation. Give it back means to restore the livelihood, demonstrate respects for what is shared, the land, by making things right through compensation, restoration of freedom, dignity, and livelihood. And everywhere, you know, so many places along the Red, you'll see ice fishing, but I've never seen it off around University of Manitoba, or seen a class, participated in a class that actually does that activity. So how do we recognize land back in this design? Which is returning life back to the land. So many of the developments have taken so much of the vitality, of the spirituality, of the sacredness of land, and definitely the sustainable livelihoods away. And realizing here's another visual showing the continuation of life, and it's in water again. And the stakes of these struggles are immense. So we're in, you know, a pivotal moment where we have the opportunity to look at Indigenous land and life, and make our education anti-colonial. At this time, I would say it's very colonial still. And we're looking at, when we study ecology even, we're not seeing, you know, trees as communicating with each other and having, you know, talking to their children and having a life. We're actually measuring them and not looking at it in a holistic and seeing the life in the land and in all subjects. We're still at that colonial control view. And how can we decolonize our education so that we can bring, you know, reconciliation to Native people, to treaty people, to all people, and also bring regenerate the land. Akosi? Thank you so much.
So I will read my poem, River People, which is about different kinds of land practices, all of which have perhaps a connection to the campus and what happens here and to the landscape of the campus. And this poem is dedicated to Thompson Highway, a very famous graduate of the University of Manitoba, and his partner, Raymond Lalonde. River People. I have come now to live with the river people. I was raised among the earth people, proud dirt under the fingernails, long, rugged, silent days of hoeing and plowing, electric barbed wire to keep the cows in, tin granaries bulging with ripe wheat, bright orange carrots rooted improbably, juicy, green feather topped in cracked black soil. Meadowlarks perched on the fence posts along the gravel road, announcing the morning with their cheery, trilling song. I lived with the lake people for a while. Sand-colored beaches, blue-gray water, sparkling sky, no fixed borders anywhere. Ground squirrels darting through the bushes, the slow put, put, put of the weather-beaten gray aluminum boat. Pungent smell of rotted fish, rustle of dead mayflies, flash of white wings and sharp beaks, shots ringing out, midnight feast for the whole clan, too much drink, aurora borealis painting the night sky, and the moon, the moon. There were the years I lived with asphalt and cement people, dedicated to glass and steel and cars and money and speed. Pinstriped linen suits over crisp white cuffs, tooled leather briefcases, color-coded digital presentations in fashionable PowerPoint, statistics, analyses, tables, maps, reports. Hurry, hurry, faster, faster, more, more. Belgian raspberry cider in gold-rimmed glasses, yachts and sailboats on the canal, parched ditches, car accidents, the singing stars muffled behind inky clouds. There were the years I lived in the air, crowded cabins with TV screens built into the seatbacks, dinners on plastic trays, smiling servants everywhere, lipstick, pantyhose, eyeshadow, stilettos, yellow turbans and hand-embroidered slippers, passports, hotel reservations, wait lines, security checks, fresh squeezed orange juice for breakfast, crisp papaya salad for lunch, pina colada at 7, ambassadorial receptions, keynote addresses, interviews, pictures in the newspapers. I have come now to live with the river people. We sit on the reedy shore and watch the water flow by, urgently, purposefully, carrying the continent's pulse and debris firmly along the bay we have heard about, on the edge of a mythical northern ocean with seal mermaids and melting ice floes far away. We watch the people living on the other side with their bigger yards and lusher gardens and louder dinner parties, knowing we live on the superior, wilder, slower, freer side. Don't we? And they, do they feel pity or envy looking across at us perched on our unadorned rocks with our fishing lines and ragged sprawling nettle and burdock groves? We chat with the geese. We watch the sun's reflection as it's going down a long, wavering red line slashing the water. We sing to the fish. We scatter many-colored flower petals to the spirit bones of our beloved, remembered, drowned, the overdosed, the lost, the disappeared, the deep heart's cry of why, 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 why? We pick wild berries, sumac, raspberry, blackberry on the shore. The smoke of our tiny backyard fires, tobacco lit, spirals upward toward the heavens. My fingers begin to remember how to weave willow baskets and bright-colored shawls. My lips begin to mutter the old songs in the old languages, my tongue curling gingerly around the strange and familiar sounds. I begin to hear the babble and gurgle, the glug, glug, glug at the earth's deep core. My mind begins to wander the swirling galaxies. What could I possibly want more?
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. This presentation is actually, it's sort of a work in progress. It's actually the precursor to another presentation that Jay and I are involved with. And this was sort of the beginnings of this sort of dialogue between he and I around what we're doing with our land-based education programs in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management. So it's a bit of going over what we're doing with the land-based education programs in the faculty, but then also talking a bit about this dialogue that we're having around our experiences with everything to do with land-based education. So the titles may be a little bit misleading on the slide, but I'll give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to talk about land-based education in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management and connect it to different things that we're doing. We're trying to build our curriculum and develop various programs, potentially leading to maybe a degree program or some type of certificate, as well as both Jay and I are involved right now in research that involves various aspects of land-based education. These also involve things related to race and colonialism and a bunch of other social issues that we can bring into the discussion, but we're mostly focused on how land-based education is being utilized by various people and organizations and communities, not only in Manitoba, but across the country, as a way to sort of engage Indigenous youth or engage other peoples around issues of reconciliation and identity. So we're going to give a brief overview of that, and then we're going to talk about our future vision of land-based education on the campus, and hopefully have a good dialogue at the end of this. So my name is Dan Henhawk. I am an assistant professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management. I am a Mohawk. I'm from the Six Nations of the Grand River in Southern Ontario. I did all my schooling at the University of Waterloo in recreation and leisure studies, where most of my work was looking at the connections, or the relationship, I should say, between colonialism and this broad concept of leisure. And I focused on looking at stories that my community had around sport and recreation, and tried to, I guess, tease out some of the tensions related to the stories that I was hearing and the understandings that I had about the connections between leisure and colonialism. So my work has been mostly about trying to unpack sort of the connections of colonialism to things like sport and recreation, and this broad concept of leisure, and how that's affecting Indigenous communities in a number of different ways. Currently, I would say my work is more focused on land-based education versus sport and recreation, but I still am trying to connect sort of these broader discussions around land-based education to, I guess, broader theories around leisure and the impacts that sort of Indigenous knowledges can have on changing how we think about things like leisure or work or sport and recreation. So that's what I'm doing, a very brief nutshell. I'll turn it over to Jay to introduce himself.
All right, thank you, Dan, and thanks to everyone else too. I'm a little bit longer in the tooth, so I just wanted to say how cool it's been to be a part of this workshop, but also to be introduced to the technology that I admit, you know, I'm a little bit slow on the uptake, if the uptake happens at all. And I'm totally going to be adopting and using GatherTown moving forward in my teaching. So at the very least, thank you for that exposure and maybe the potential of making me the cool guy in the block for once. I'm actually coming to you from my office here on campus in the Frank Kennedy Center. I guess I could turn the camera around and show my dead plant that has been watered in over a year, I'm guessing, but maybe there's too much symbolism in there for us to unpack for today. What I can tell you about myself is I'm here actually in my 9th year in Winnipeg, which has been great, except for those first few winters. Before that, I was in California in San Jose, where I taught for 5 years. You can see the picture up here. San Jose State was the flashpoint for a lot of civil rights in the United States, particularly in the 60s through sport. So that was a great place to be for me, and Dr. Harry Edwards and Tommy Smith and John Carlos became colleagues and friends over the years of being there, and certainly shaped a lot of the research that I was doing. I actually grew up about 40 minutes away from where Dan grew up as well. So I think we're kindred in that way, although both sides of my family do come from Quebec. I grew up in Southern Ontario and I did my schooling there too at the University of Toronto and Guelph. I teach and I research primarily in the social sciences. And while I've researched a lot of different areas related to the social sciences, sport, leisure and recreation, really the main research foci for the last 10 years has been on Indigenous youth, land-based education, physical activity, recreation, but also looking at sustainability and the intersections with sport, the body, and leisure as well, which has been very fruitful. And then the longest stream that's kind of coursed throughout my research career, I guess, going back to 25 years, is actually looking at hazing in sport and the problematic culture there. So a little bit of a diversity in terms of what I do, but I'm really shaped by my environment too that I'm existing in. And Winnipeg has been the same too. So I don't have control of moving the slides, but I guess I'll cue Dan. Thanks. So one of the things that Dan introduced was this idea. We wanted to share a little bit of our history and our engagement with not only Indigenous land-based education and how we've gotten to where we are today, but also in land-based education and sort of that fluid term of outdoor education or outdoor recreation. We actually have a pretty storied history here that really just kind of broke up prior to me getting here 9 years ago. But we had a more robust recreation management faculty, and that was steeped in a lot of outdoor education. And most people have spread out either across campus or actually across the country in different faculties. Unfortunately, there is that legacy of courses that, and almost a program that have been built around outdoor education for our students in FKRM, which are 4 letters that should come quite easily. So I came in at a time that I have a background, not only my research, but my personal life too, of engaging in land-based education. So I was able to revive some of the old courses, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, as is Dan. But from the time that I came here, our faculty started talking about a vision and developing Indigenous specific focused land-based education. And we were successfully able to secure 2 hires that you can see the pictures here. Obviously, Dan Henhawk is one, and Brian Rice, our other colleague, were hired on almost 3 years ago, or 3 years ago in Brian's case, to be Indigenous land-based educators. So prior to that, we developed a couple of courses for them to step in because it is a process. So there was a couple of courses that we had in addition to our outdoor education courses that Dan and Brian were able to step into and then develop. And we're going to talk about that ongoing process and some of our ideas and what we're trying to do in terms of expanding that vision and expanding our physical ideas of Indigenous land-based education. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. Next slide. So in addition to Dan and Brian in our faculty, Heather McCrae, who was just recognized as the recipient of the Mykietowich Award, too, I wanted to sing her praise and her props, has been in our faculty for probably 10 years now. And her position has changed and evolved over those years, but she is now, her position is as Director for Indigenous Engagement, specific to the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Management. So out of that platform, and this is something that myself and Dan and Brian and a few other people obviously are integrally involved with too, but they've been able to continue to develop a program that's called Rec and Read, and I'll talk about that in a sec too, which is across Winnipeg in our school systems. About 3 years ago, Heather developed a powwow meeting for whoever wanted to attend once a week, based out of that portfolio as well. There's been several programs that are designed around Indigenous specific achievement, not only in terms of hires for our faculty, but also in terms of students. That's involved outreach onto reserves and creating relationships and liaisons to create more of an easy pathway for transition into sport or into our faculty in our program as well. And then another major pillar that is a part of our faculty too is the Indigenous Youth Mentorship Program, or what we call the IYMP, that's been going on since 2004. And when we talk more specifically about some of the research that's developed out of our faculty and through our faculty, I'll talk a little bit more about that program too. So I believe with that, I'm going to hand it back over. Oh, sorry, no, a couple more. So Spark, so obviously you can see by our introduction, we're doing lots in terms of a faculty, I would say. It's fair to categorize it that way, in terms of Indigenous outreach and achievement. So Spark is another one, which is a program that was developed initially by a former colleague of ours, who some of you might know, Dr. Joni Hallis, who retired, I think almost 2 years ago now, maybe getting out in time, right? Just pre-pandemic. Anyways, Joni had been here quite a long time and has been really integrally bound into an Indigenous programming and research as well throughout her career, and is well known throughout the community. And this was one of her passion projects that she really wanted to make sure that before she retired happened. What it is it's a community outreach program that is through the university, recognized as a credential degree, that invites physical educators on reserve to take an intensive program, which we call Spark, that's set up around different modules or units that are taught in a very aggressive, condensed format, that some of our faculty, like Dan, are involved in teaching some of the different modules or the different units, which include Indigenous land-based education too. That is one of the major threads that courses throughout this programming. And then once these community leaders graduate and write a test and are recognized with the degree, that then makes them sort of a qualified person in their community to work within the school systems, teaching physical activity, teaching phys ed programs to Indigenous students on reserve. And then the last thing that I wanted to highlight is something that myself, Dan, Brian, Heather really kind of took the lead on, is creating a specific Indigenous land-based education conference, where we invited Indigenous elders from across Manitoba that are engaged in Indigenous land-based education. And we hosted a 2-day conference here on campus to have those roundtable discussions outdoors, and also sort of have, sessions where we can introduce how different communities, different Indigenous communities across the province engage in land-based education as a way of bringing a larger circle into that, not only the discussion part of it, but also the practical experiential side of it as well. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened, so we weren't able to revive it the next year, which was last year. but we're in the process of putting together a grant to secure some funding to host this in the fall again, in a little bit different format. It would be cyber, obviously online. And we also wanted to expand to include Indigenous land-based educators from around the world as well to sit at the table and to share their knowledge and to experience the knowledge of our land-based educators here in the province as well. Dan?
Great, thanks, Jay. Okay, so that's a brief history of all of our programs in FKRM. What I thought I would do is speak to you about a course that I run, which is an introductory course. So I run Rec 2130. It's an introduction to Indigenous land-based education and outdoor recreation. And I want to share this because I want to, I guess, give you my understanding and my interpretation of what Indigenous land-based education is in relation to discussions around outdoor recreation and Indigenous knowledges. I run this course in a way that tries to get the students engaged in understanding, I guess, connections to the land. And the way that I do that is they have a term project where they actually have to go out and engage in some type of outdoor recreation. And when they're out doing their activity, they then have to stop and try and capture their experience. And the way they do this is through field journaling. So I got this idea from a colleague of mine at University of Waterloo who utilizes this book called Finding Place by Dr. Lynn Baldwin. She's an artist and ecologist from Thompson Rivers University, and she utilizes field journaling in her own work, and she also has gotten some recognition for engaging her students in this way. So it's kind of spreading out slowly to a bunch of different educators around utilizing field journaling as a means of capturing experience, and I'm going to talk about that at the end of this after I talk about Indigenous knowledges. So when I speak to the students about I guess Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous notions of ways, or Indigenous ways of being and Indigenous ways of knowing, I draw a lot from Sean Wilson and his discussions around relationality. So if we think about, how do we know what we know? You can think about, if we think about more of a what we call a post-positivistic way of knowing, you would sort of maybe send out a survey and you would gather some data and you would take those numbers from that information and you would try and generalize some type of concept to a population. So that would be like an example of a way of knowing information and a way of understanding the world. But Indigenous notions of understanding are, I would say, much, much different than sort of that understanding of the world. And that's just an example. There's a broad spectrum of how we understand the world. But Indigenous ways of knowing are very much built upon, I guess, a holistic understanding of the world where we're bringing in entire systems of knowledge through the relationships that we have with the environment, with all the things in the world and the cosmos that we would say, refer to as our relations. And the one quote that always sticks out to me from his work is he talks about, rather than viewing ourselves as being in relationship with other people and things, we are the relationships that we hold and are part of. So that means that our knowledge and our understanding of ourselves is based upon the relationships that we already have established with the things in the world, whether that's people or our other relations that are, either in the environment or in the cosmos. So those relationships inform essentially who we are, and we are constantly sort of interpreting that knowledge, and that informs sort of our way of being on the planet. So it informs what we do and how we do it. And then I talked to him about I guess different sort of tenets around Indigenous knowledges. There's a good discussion by Julie Caprica and Mark Dockstader around the idea that Indigenous knowledges and quote unquote Western knowledges can come together to inform environmental education, as long as we understand sort of the main tenets of what Indigenous knowledge is trying to represent and accomplish. So they talk about Indigenous worldviews being based upon relationships. Again, the idea that knowledge is shared with all of creation, that we as human beings have a responsibility to maintain that relational way of thinking, so that we maintain our relationships with everything. That there is a reciprocity in how we understand the world, that we are actually in reciprocal relationships with all of our relations, and that we have to treat everything with respect. I would say that these are 4 really good sort of tenets of Indigenous knowledges that sort of cut across various other discussions as well. I then bring in another discussion around sort of what's happening in outdoor recreation from an Indigenous perspective. And Philip Mullins and Gregory Lowen-Trudeau and Karen Fox are actually non-Indigenous researchers, but they have really taken up the mantle of thinking about Indigenous knowledges in relation to outdoor recreation, and sort of what's happened or what has happened in the past in relation to how past histories have influenced how we think about outdoor space, as well as how we think about outdoor recreation. So if you think about how we think about outdoor recreation, you know, whatever it is that you like to do out in the world, that all has a history that is probably has had some influence related to how Indigenous peoples or how settler colonial peoples have thought about the outdoors and the environment. So they talk about this colonial haunting of Western outdoor recreation and outdoor education. And they essentially relate that history to the destruction of what they call autochthonous ways of living, which is essentially a word for understandings of being from a place. And so Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous peoples and their cultures were, disrupted through colonialism. And as a result, there is a destruction or a displacement of very specific place-based understandings of the world and place-based ways of living, depending on where people were from. And that happened again through wars, it happened through various other conflicts, that happened through removals of communities to different parts of the world. So how did this happen? Generally, when we talk about colonialism, at least in this context, we're talking about, I would say, settler colonial or Western concepts of land as a perception of how, when people came to this new world, to North America, they had various understandings of various perspectives and understandings of how they were seeing North America. So they saw land as something to be conquered, something to be occupied, something to be maybe visited, but not necessarily inhabited, because the idea is that you should be living in maybe more condensed urban centers. And this was reinforced through concepts like the wilderness as being sort of this broad expanse of wilderness, of forest that had no people living in it, and was devoid of human influence. There's also concepts like terra nullius, that is Latin for land belonging to nobody, that was also front and center of sort of European exploration. And then also that exploration was driven by things like the doctrine of discovery, which was the legal and moral justification of colonial dispossession of Indigenous peoples from their lands, as well as this idea of manifest destiny, where there was the belief that settlers had there was an inevitable expansion of places like the United States, and that's where this concept really flourished. It happened through, if we think about connecting it to things like outdoor recreation, we actually have to go back a little bit further and think about sort of the influences of various things in the past that have influenced things like outdoor education. So if we think about the British youth expeditions, or we think about mountaineering conquests, or we even think about something as simple as canoe tripping as a way of naturalizing Canadian national identity. All those types of activities, which we would probably classify as outdoor recreation now, have a history rooted in, again, colonial exploration. There's also a history that talks about the scouting movement and Lord Baden-Powell as being the founder of the scouting movement, and how that movement was actually connected to things like British imperialism in Africa. Essentially, the scouting movement was born out of Baden-Powell's desire to create a means for young boys to develop their character and their skills and their ideas around masculinity and all these types of things that have become associated with Scouts. In relation to, again, the British Empire's exploration and conquering of various regions of the world. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's another movement that was, or another organization that came out of sort of similar movements, which was Outward Bound. Kurt Hahn was the founder of this, and he essentially wanted a way of training merchant marines to stay alive when their ships may be sunk and they had to, abandon ship and be on some life rafts. So there was this whole movement towards learning skills and gaining knowledge around how to survive in the environment, not only on the water, but then onto land. And that was born out of World War II. And these types of things have very huge influences on things like adventure education. So bringing that back then to Indigenous knowledges, sort of, juxtaposing that history, I talked to the students about that history of and how that's influenced how we think about the environment, and how we think about our engagement with land, and how we think about things like outdoor recreation. And then I bring that discussion back to talking about Indigenous knowledges and what Indigenous knowledge, or what Indigenous people value in terms of knowledge, I guess, so to speak. So one of the things that I guess Indigenous knowledge's values is the practical application or embodiment of said knowledge. So for many, knowledge is actually knowledge and experience. So you have to actually go and experience something, and that's how you learn, and that's how you, again, get to put into practice those other tenets of Indigenous knowledges that I mentioned, so respect and reciprocity. When you do that, then you're learning about how to be, from a Mohawk perspective, we would say how to be an original person in the world, where you are actually honoring your relations and honoring your responsibilities as a human being. So you then become, you then start to live sort of this embodied way of knowing the world through the actions that you actually engage in. So there is an embodied performance that I guess informed, or that is the result of Indigenous knowledges, that is evident in the way that people act and the products that they make and the ways in which we all shape our world. I talked to them about Indigenous knowledge as being a relationship. Again, relating it back to this notion of relationality, we talk about Indigenous knowledge is relationship in that it develops through and exists with experiences that are already social, spiritual, and ecological. So I think that's a key point to remember here, is that when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, that our knowledge base is always based upon things that are already sort of engaged with our relations. This is a very different perspective than thinking about sort of I would say a Western perspective that sees human beings as being separate from the environment, that sees the world through a very anthropocentric viewpoint, where humans are the center and humans are the ones that sort of control, or at least try to control, the world, versus an Indigenous perspective that doesn't place human beings at the center, but places us as part of these relationships that we already have. As a result of that, if you think about being in relationship and as your person as being the result of these relationships, then you can start to see how maybe Indigenous peoples have communal understandings of the world. So communal understandings versus sort of individualistic understandings of the world. So if we think of a we first and not an I, the question becomes, how does that then change your experience of the world? Relatedness then, or relationship, is then is something that is being attentive to and responsive to persons and things around oneself and one's relationship with them. So I give them all that, we have all those discussions, and I give them all that knowledge around Indigenous knowledges, and I ask the students to go out in the world and engage in some type of outdoor recreation that is meaningful to them. And this past term, I got them specifically to do field journaling through drawing. Before I was a little bit lenient and have them, take pictures or maybe take a little bit of video. But this term, I really want them to actually draw, regardless of how good they thought they were at drawing. The point was to draw and actually engage in the process, because it takes a little bit more time. It takes a little bit more thought to sort of think about what you're drawing and to connect to some of those elements in the environment that speak to, again, your connection. This is an example from Lynn Baldwin. This is her field journal, and as you can see, he brings in a lot of different elements into her field journal. So she actually has a bit of a map here that shows, maybe different elevations and where she's been. She's obviously labeling some of the flora that she's come across, as well as some of the insects. And then as well, she's journaling and she's writing her understandings as she goes along in this process. Again, I think this is really key for this discussion, because she outlines how engaging in this process really helps her to understand her connection and her responsibilities as a human being. So this is an example here of one of the field journals from one of my students this past term. You probably all recognize this place as being the Forks. Again, this would be an example of the student going out and engaging with the place that sort of is meaningful to them. This student in particular went for a walk with her mom, and actually don't know whether she took the time to draw during this day, because she mentions how it was the day that there was the huge halo around the sun. So that was a very cold day. But she at least maybe took some mental notes, or maybe she did take a picture, but then she transferred that into some type of drawing that, again, tried to capture all the details that was connecting her to that environment. I thought it was really, when you read the whole document, it was really well done in terms of her explaining all the elements that sort of she was seeing at the Forks, and things that really sort of spoke to her connection to that place, again, along with her mom. This is another example. What I really enjoyed about this example is all of the different elements that the student drew into her field journal, and the different representations that she utilized to represent things like the wind, or silence, or she has wind biting, so it must have been fairly cold when she was out doing her activity. The different sounds that she had about, crunching through the snow, the different observations she made about a little pond or stream to the right here. And then drawing the compass on the left here, situating herself in terms of where she was at. She was trying very hard to be aware of her surroundings and to capture all of those things that were speaking to her, her experience in that moment in the activity that she was doing. And I think it's, I'd like to think that this whole process was successful for a lot of students in my class, where it gave them something different to think about and a different way of connecting to their environment and through the activities that they were engaged in, as well as then trying to maybe connect some of that experience to our discussions around, you know, relationship and responsibility. So just some food for thought, and then I'll turn it back over to Jay. For those of you as you go through the rest of your workshop, you know, some things that you might want to think about. You know, how do you design space that facilitates a relational way of being, or can you? Is it something that can be created through the design of space? You know, this idea of Indigenous notions of relationality, is that something that can actually be designed? What types of experiences are you hoping to facilitate or accommodate in the design of space? You know, are you looking at educational experiences? Are you looking at recreational experiences? Are you looking at sustainable experiences, depending on how we define what sustainability is? And then how can a space like the Eastern Transportation Corridor help to promote meaningful outdoor recreational experiences and Indigenous land-based educational experiences like the one that I just described in Rec 2130. So hopefully those are just something for you to sort of chew on and think about as you move through the rest of your workshop. And we'll turn this back to Jay.
All right, excuse me, thanks for that, Dan. So this dovetails really nicely in terms of the examples that we want to provide you that connect to what Dan just talked about how we're on this personal journey as individuals, but also as academics, and how it's being infused in our curriculum and how we choose to approach our courses, how we choose to approach our research. But also, and we're not going to get too much into this discussion, but how, you know, in my case, but I know this comes out of a lot of discussions that I have with Dan or Brian or other scholars about how we have to operate within a very strict colonial structure, and academia is no different. And those artificial metrics that were held to, like tenure and promotion, to gauge and to provide value to what's considered research or what's considered teaching. And, you know, how we're working to personally, but also structurally, to break down a lot of those barriers to provide different experiences that are steeped in Indigenous land-based experiences, but also Indigenous methodologies or methods. And the two examples I want to provide for you, and I'll just touch on it briefly, is the structure I stepped into 9 years ago too, and how outdoor education was being done in that very colonial Western way. And that's the codified structure that I would have to step into and did step into with the two courses I instruct, which are outdoor education and leadership and wilderness adventures, which are based around that experience, that experiential interaction in some type of natural environment, engaging in land-based education. And, you know, how personally I've been trying to exploit sort of those edges or those boundaries to really kind of push it into, to morph it into something else. But also how, you know, Dan and Brian becoming my colleagues too, how that has shaped how we're moving forward with our sort of collective vision and how we are teaching or delivering or interacting with the curriculum and with the students and with each other, and how these different kind of perspectives are all blending together to what we hope is creating a very different experience that does come out of that Indigenous land-based experience. Sorry, Dan, if you could just click on. So for me, you know, I've been teaching now 8 years, these two courses. And what I did from the get-go was reach out to Indigenous elders to make sure that a part of, you know, the course, even though it was sort of coming out of that background of how others taught it before in a very structured way, to provide the students and myself the experience of some type of Indigenous land-based experience. You know, we've done a lot of things over the years, depending on who I've been able to build a relationship or to foster that partnership with in terms of the elder. And then, you know, of course, there's space too. But, you know, you can see some of the images here, obviously canoe trips, but, you know, engaging in a sweat, engaging in the tobacco ceremony, you know, being on the land, camping on the land, doing excursions to, the White Shell, which is where we've done some of our outdoor adventures before, either hiking the Ontario Trail or going on extended canoe trips. But the petroforms are just near there too, right? Which is a big part of Indigenous culture and history here in Manitoba. So that's been a part of their experience too. But also, one of the structures that we have to adhere to is grading, right? And providing some kind of structural feedback, but also pushing those boundaries like Dan just described with what he's doing, but making it more student-centered as well, so that they are in terms of building and developing the curriculum prior to and as we're going through the experience too, as to what they want to do and what they want to bring to it, providing that element of communal leadership too, and that circular mentorship approach. I also have them go sit in the middle of the woods for an extended period of time and, record that experience in some way. So whether it's journaling or whether it's creating an e-journal or a video of those experiences as they go through the course too, and how it is having an effect on them as students, but also in terms of how they view the world, their worldview, and how they touch everything as well. Okay, Dan? I also wanted to give a nod to Brian Rice, our colleague, who is one of the two Indigenous land-based educators hired at the same time as Dan that I mentioned previously. But he just ran his first Rec 3770 Indigenous land-based education course. And he ran it very successfully, but set it up so that it takes place on campus and within the city of Winnipeg. And it's completely centered around Indigenous land-based education. And he does really cool things. So one, I do recommend this course. You have to have a level of physical fitness because Brian engages the students in a lot of walking. One of the excursions, I think in an afternoon or a day, ended up being close to 15 to 17 kilometers. But, he would give sort of those interactive experiential experiences with the students to the Indigenous history just here in the city too, right? So whether it was the last residential school that is still in the city and is now child welfare, ironically, the rich Indigenous history that is on campus, and you can see here just across the river, that's that's Louis Riel's house, which you probably learned he only actually lived in for a year. The time that he spent longer, right, is the house on the Seine River here in Winnipeg too, which Brian includes on his excursion. Obviously going to the Truth and Reconciliation Center and talking through that as well, or the Forks, or even the experimental agricultural lands, which as you learned too, were Métis settlements at one time. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight too is that what has happened since Dan and Brian and myself have started to collaborate and design, we are creating more courses, but we're also, I guess, teaching these courses together. It started as we would guest lecture for one or two classes, but it's evolving into actually co-teaching a lot of our future classes too, and maybe even some of the classes that we have. So bringing that idea that Dan introduced, right, as to both of these experiences, the more Western approach of outdoor education, sort of grafted on to Indigenous land-based experiences as well. This has also infused its way into the research that we do, and I put research in quotation marks because, as Simpson says, which I believe too, is that research is ceremony. And that's been a part of my personal journey too. And I'm even reluctant to call it research because it's based around, building that relationship, building trust, but also, you're all architects within that system. There's no separation between researcher and participant. Everyone is a researcher that has an active part in that. And I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I developed sort of an outreach program with a group I was working with here in the city to be a part for some of the youth who are high school age to be a part of our outdoor ed course and to shape the curriculum and to have those common experiences with university students. So the class is taking place here or, in some aspect of the natural environment. I'm not going to go into the specifics of who the group were, but, they were Indigenous youth who were in the system in some way and had been removed from their families. So we really wanted to develop a program where, you know, Indigenous university students, so undergrads and graduate students in our faculty, could create something together with this group too, and share that experience. And what we came up with, sorry if you can just, was a whole series of events that we did, you know, so whether we were on Fort White, learning to paddle, learning to canoe, engaging in Indigenous ceremonies, sweats, building bundles, understanding and having that experience of going through, you know, the different parts of the ceremonies. And that's the university students and the youth as well. You know, camping, harvesting, and engaging in traditional games. We went ice fishing, we created art, and culminated over that period of time, which was a few years, of doing a 5-day canoe trip in Quetico and having that experience together. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but if you ever get the chance to go to Quetico, which is about a 5-hour drive from here and borders Ontario and Minnesota, it's a fantastic park, you know, steeped in Indigenous history, and you're able to see part of that and have those stories told, you know, see the petroglyphs. Yeah, so it was a really rewarding experience. And I just wanted to highlight, sorry, the next slide too, of the profound effect that it had engaging in Indigenous land-based education for the participants, both the mentors, people like myself that I guess were seen as whatever, faculty or, you know, support staff, and also the youth themselves too, and just how it created a sense of connection to the land, sense of Indigenous identity, and really opened up a lot of doorways and pathways, and having sort of that dialogue and engagement with who you are as an individual, but the importance of that connection to the land too. And I believe the last one here is just, you know, a quote that reflects sort of that experience. And I don't need to read it to you, but there was many of these profound sort of insights after the experience, and actually well after the experience too.
Okay, I am cognizant of the time, and I'm sorry, Michaela, that we've gone over just a bit of time here, but I'll try and wrap this up in the next minute. Essentially, what we're doing now is we're building relationships across the campus. We're trying to take, you know, our curriculum and expand it by working with various departments and faculties across campus. This is a list of current relationships that we are building. We're also trying to reach out into the community. We have some relationships building with Parks Canada at the Forks, the Pembina School Board, the Manitoba First Nations Education Research Council, our SPARK program and RecRead, etc., as well as places like Fort White and the type of work that they're doing there. Here is a picture of obviously the campus. I just wanted to point out to you here what we were thinking in terms of our program is we're trying to figure out where do we do land-based education on campus. It's a daunting task because although there seems to be a lot of space, it's very limited because there's either spaces that are dedicated to research, or there's, you know, lots of buildings around that doesn't lend itself to maybe certain types of land-based education. But then there's also opportunities of engaging in sort of land-based education in various opportunities. If you look at the area of the Eastern Transportation Corridor, and you look to the north of the point lands here, there's a strip of land here north of the fields that is relatively underutilized in terms of research. And so we've been in contact with campus planning and the Faculty of Agriculture, and we've been trying to figure out where in that little spot in the north part of that point land that we could maybe potentially use as part of our curriculum. But that we just wanted to show the slide just to sort of, I guess, give you an idea of what we're trying to deal with in terms of figuring out how to do land-based education on the campus. So our future vision is one to develop our curriculum, perhaps turn it into some type of a minor or a major or some type of credential. We want to, you know, seek out space on campus to develop land-based education. Maybe it will lead to some type of physical structure where people can gather and engage in, maybe storytelling or ceremony or something like that. We don't know. Ultimately, we would love to have this developed through partnerships. So the idea would be to have undergraduates and graduate students from various faculties come together and help us inform what this space might look like, as well as inform some of the curriculum that we can continue to offer through our faculty. So thank you very much for that. And again, sorry that we went over a bit, but we look forward to any questions and engaging in conversations in the next while.
Sorry, I just wanted to add briefly too, piggybacking on what Dan was just introducing, the last part, like our paths are kind of crossing at an ideal time, right? Because myself and Dan probably walked the campus for about a year until we found what we would describe as the most ideal spot to house an Indigenous land-based education center, so a physical structure on campus. And that point that Dan was describing to, which is really just adjacent to the Eastern Corridor, through our partnership with agriculture, we have been granted permission to use that space for a physical structure. So we're actually at the phase now where we're branching out and trying to brainstorm, what is that physical structure going to look like? What are the components to it going to be? What's it going to be used for, and who's going to have access to it, right? So we're really looking at sort of having discussions, but then brainstorming sessions like this around those specific ideas. And of course, this is all contingent on funding, right? So we're having to knock on a lot of doors too to try and see if we can't get some financial support and backing to provide sort of the brick and mortar side of, or twig and branch side of, this approach. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we're soliciting in terms of the breakout sections, is just like, what sort of potentials do you see and how this can spread across campus in terms of the ideas, in terms of the programming, but also in terms of the physical integration of those ideas, concepts, and structures too. So thank you. We look forward to your expertise and feedback.
So again, yeah, thank you for this invitation to talk about this really special project called Voices of the Land. As Michaela said, I'm a Master of Landscape Architecture student at the U of M. I myself completed the Bachelor of Environmental Design degree in 2016, and I was able to work for a few years, and then I came back and started actually with Michaela in 2019 for the master's program. So Voices of the Land is a publication that myself and a few other incredible women, so these other women here. So this is Rihanna Marasti. Rihanna Marasti is in her, she just actually wrapped up her Master of Architecture degree. And so Rihanna and I met in the fall of 2019 and founded the Indigenous Design and Planning Student Association. And that was really born out of our desire to create a space for Indigenous conversations to happen in the Faculty of Architecture and for it to really come from the student voice. And we were grateful that we had, that we have and still receive really great response and engagement with a lot of our ideas and initiatives. This book is just one of the examples that we've been able to do. We also held a speaker series this whole year called Honoring Our Mother, where we brought in Indigenous practitioners who weren't directly related to the field of design, but who had influence in the field of design. And they sparked some really great conversations that we've still continued in our faculty today. And this is Desiree Theriault. She just finished her Master of Landscape Architecture degree. And then this is Danielle Desjardins, and she's currently in her Master of Architecture degree. And so all of us together were editors for Voices of the Land. And so you might be wondering where the term Voices of the Land came from. So we were struggling with, what do we call this? What is this publication? We knew we wanted to create something that showcased our voice from our perspective, but we just didn't know how it would all come together in a package. So I was reading the TRC executive summary for a class that I was in, and I stumbled upon this quote, and it just jumped out at us, where it reads, "I'm so filled with belief and hope because when I hear your voices at the table, I hear and know that the responsibilities of our ancestors are carried and are still being carried. And even through all the struggles, even through all of what has been disrupted, we can still hear the voices of the land. And so for us, when we read that quote, when I presented it to the group, there was just a real sense of, conviction, and we just felt so excited and just inspired by this quote. So it quickly became the title, and it just worked and brought everything together. It tied it together really well. And so one of the biggest things about this book is that we really wanted to dedicate it to Indigenous youth. So for ourselves, we never saw our cultures or our histories reflected accurately in the way that we were taught about design and place. And so we really hoped that this small publication could be something that youth could see themselves in, and hopefully one day see themselves as an architect, as a landscape architect, interior designer, or a planner. And so that was really one of the biggest things behind it. And as I think Michaela just mentioned, there were 16 students that participated or submitted work to this publication. And most of us were from the central region of Canada, mainly from Manitoba. But there's so much diversity within this. And one of the unique things that we were really lucky to have was to have First Nations, Métis, and Inuit representation all throughout this book. And so that is really, really great. And I think unique in terms of, an architecture school. And I think one of the things, I've talked about this book a lot, and I'm so grateful. Rihanna and I are so grateful to have had so many opportunities to talk about this book. And the way that we really define it, and the way that we think it has the most impact, is to really talk about it as a collection of stories. So these are stories from 16 students, and the way that the book is set up is each student submitted. We just said, submit something that you are really proud of. So in some cases, in most cases actually, the students ended up submitting some of their studio work. So they would have worked on this type of work over the course of either a full academic year, so 2 semesters, or even just 1 semester. But we let them just say, okay, give us something that you are really proud of and that you want to showcase to the world. And there's so much diversity even in the projects that were submitted to this. And then so each section where the student had submitted their project work, so it starts off with a small bio on who the student is, and we ask them a question. The question that we asked them to answer, was what inspired you to go into design, and how do you bring your culture into your design work? And so even just to hear where the students had come from in discovering their indigeneity in design and how that had evolved over the course of their time in the Faculty of Architecture was really impactful and quite beautiful. And then they subsequently submitted a description of the project that they submitted. So when you see the book, and I'll actually, maybe it was already shared, but I'll include a link to the digital copy of this book. We made that free and available for everyone to look at. And then secondary, we felt it was really important to interview Indigenous alumni and practitioners from the Faculty of Architecture. So this is one example. There are 4 interviews in the book. And so one of them, this one's about practice in the profession. And so all 3 of these architects listed here, Sean Bailey is actually still active in the faculty. He's the Indigenous scholar, but they all had relationships to the faculty, and really just to hear about their journey and their transition from being a student into practice, and getting advice from them on how they went about that journey, I think is really powerful and impactful. And there's some really great lessons throughout all of these interviews that are present in that. And I thought I had another slide, but I guess I don't. But I think one of the biggest things that I would share about this is that it is a collection of stories. And so that process of understanding people's story, giving people the platform to share who they are from their own perspective, I think was such a great, someone shared it in the chat, I see now, the digital copy, thank you. But yeah, I think the narrative of storytelling, and how do we position ourselves to understand our own stories, but then tell stories as designers, I think is one of the biggest lessons that I've taken from this, my involvement with this book. And yeah, again, thank you so much for bringing me here today. I'm happy to be here, and then I'm excited to hear Honoure's presentation as well. And then I think there's a little time for Q&A at the end, if I remember correctly. Great. So, well, thank you for hearing my presentation.
I crafted this presentation around my research and specifically around Indigenous works of public art. But I also made sure that what I was selecting and how I'm kind of phrasing it or framing it, I hope will provide some useful tools or some concepts or just some inspiration for you in your charrette process, in your design process. So we'll see. And of course, I'm open to any sort of questions and everything like that afterwards. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay, great. All right, so I'll start a little bit more formally now. So yes, I'm Honoure Black. I'm an instructor for the Faculty of Architecture, and I'm also a PhD candidate in the design and planning program here at the U of M. And I should mention, if anyone is interested in the PhD program, I'm happy to have a conversation about it. It's very new, it's very small, but it's really exciting. So let me know if you have any questions about that at all. Being that it's in the Faculty of Architecture, but a doctoral program, one of the reasons why I chose it is because I am a transdisciplinary scholar. So I have knowledge rooted in art history, landscape history and theory, and Indigenous studies. I'm a settler white woman. I have no knowledge of my ancestral heritage other than my mother's side is Norwegian and Swedish, and my father's side is British. And more immediately, I'm half American and half Canadian. And I strive really hard as a feminist and to work as a decolonial ally. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on Treaty 1 territory, which is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I respect the treaties that were made on these territories. I acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and I dedicate myself to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I also acknowledge that my water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So I'm going to start to share my screen now. Okay, so everybody can see that all right? Okay, awesome. So public art can be used to memorialize, commemorate, celebrate, and activate both people and places on the land. It can be used as a design tool or as a conduit between the built environment and the landscape, often crossing into disciplines such as architecture, landscape architecture, city planning, art history, and fine arts, to name a few. Public art can create sites of social participation for individuals and communities, allowing for education and storytelling. In Winnipeg, contemporary public art has initiated sites of resurgence and reconciliation for First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people. Since 2015, with the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action, one specific call, the 79th, has lent to an influx of public art in our city. The 79th call states, "We call upon the federal government in collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal organizations, and the arts community to develop a reconciliation framework for Canadian heritage and commemoration." Since the release of the TRC and funding organizations such as the Winnipeg Arts Council, the Winnipeg Foundation, and partnerships with the Forks and the City of Winnipeg, a rapid influx of contemporary public art has begun to visually contribute to unsettling our settler colonial city. This is more recently lent to the Welcoming Winnipeg initiative, which is an aspect of the reconciliation process the city is committed to helping ensure that contributions, experiences, and perspectives of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are reflected truthfully in our stories, historical markers, and place names. Even last Saturday's opinion in the Winnipeg Free Press, Dr. Negan Sinclair's article titled Indigenous Lodge, a welcome site and welcoming site, illustrated some of the changes that has been made to the Forks and more broadly to Winnipeg. For the past 3 years, the Forks has seen a radical overhaul with the creation of new and accessible walkways, security lighting, the planting of medicines, and a handful of public art projects recognizing the rich presence and contributions of Indigenous communities. And that list kind of is something we could consider for the charrette designs, right? With leaderships at the Forks and funding from sources that include the Manitoba 150 and the Winnipeg Foundation, Dr. Sinclair has assisted in curating the outdoor space to tell the story of Indigenous life in this place. One can find Cree, Ojibwe, and Michif signage explaining the history of Winnipeg and treaties. People can listen to a walking app as they explore the area. And the Forks has become one of the largest collections of Indigenous-led public expressions in any historical site in Canada. So perhaps these kind of ideas that are occurring at the Forks, like I mentioned, might be part of your consideration. So with all of these new interventions, Indigenous artists have begun to replace, make, and reclaim and remap the urban landscape with site-specific art. Indigenous public art and Resurgence has begun to address settler interrelated systems of disposition on the land. And one of these ways has been through contemporary creative placemaking. I'm inspired by Towanda Seneca scholar and geographer Mishana Goman, who developed the Native feminist notion of remapping spaces on the land. The concept of remapping unsettles and reorganizes bodies in both the social and political landscapes. By using the parentheses in remapping, Goman illustrates the fact that remapping for Indigenous people employ traditional and new tribal stories as acts of continuation. I believe this is a way to move forward and to alter contemporary settler colonial constructs of space. And hopefully you can think of this idea of remapping as you design these spaces for the U of M campus. Another concept I think will be inspirational for you as designers, and Naomi talked about storytelling as well, is the concept of storytelling or the methodology of story work. And that was devised by Stolo First Nation scholar Joanne Archibald in her book, Decolonizing Research, Indigenous Story Work as Methodology. Story work is an Indigenous methodology based on story making, storytelling, and the cultural understanding of the sense of stories. Story work ignites Indigenous land knowledge as an act of decolonization, and it communicates through generations and memories in opposition to the Western exclusive and dominant story, which has emerged from ideologies of colonialism. Under the umbrella of decolonizing research, story work aspires to recover, recognize, recreate, represent, and research back. So therefore, I believe that storytelling is significantly expressed through public art as a dialogical connection to the land. We can think of this as an act to share worldviews and histories erased by settler colonialism. So now to round out this presentation, I have given you some terms to think about, but now I want to share with you some sites of public art, particularly in Winnipeg, that might prove inspirational for your designs. I'll present each of these works in a narrative manner, the way that I experienced them, and then the way that I went and conducted research prior and after. But these are very reflective writings. I call them site writing. The term site writing was inspired and developed by Jane Rendell, who is a very prominent scholar. It's a very reflective and somewhat personal experience. So the first, I have some terms that in this PowerPoint that we can look at afterwards, but I'm going to jump right into Nimama. So I found Nimama on South Point Path, which guided me along the most southern point of the Forks in downtown Winnipeg. Here directly on the path, Nimama stands as a colossal 30-foot tall sculpture made of polished painted steel, copper, and Corten metal. Nimama translates to my mother in Cree, Ojibwe, and Métis. She was designed collaboratively by Indigenous artists Casey Adams, Jamie Isaac, and Val Vint. Geographically, the historic site of the Forks overlooks the lands and the rivers of the Red and the Assiniboia in a place called Nestawaya, 3 points, referring to the mouth of the Assiniboine River and to the events that happened there. This place is not just about two rivers, though. It is a storied place where people came from 3 directions along the rivers to meet, share, and create community and to make life for a millennia. In my opinion, Nestawaya could be the official name or should be the official name of the Forks because it would demonstrate an act of reconciliation through language. As a work of public art, Ni Mama is the gatekeeper to Nestawea. Unified with nature, she is part of the sky, the trees, and the landscape. Although she is incredibly large, she does not block a single vantage point. She holds an immense amount of negative space, which allowed me to move through and inside her womb. She is the personification of earth and of water, and of the responsibility of Indigenous women as the keepers and carriers of water. It is a woman that is both the literal and figurative carrier of water, in ceremonial water walks, fetching water for family and community, and as the mother who carries her unborn child in her watery womb. I see Ni Mama as a story of female sacred power, as the giver of life. As I stood inside her womb, it was as if I was a child not yet born. I was surrounded by her spirit and framed by different symbols representing the land, the water, and constellations which trickled down her 7 cascading strands of hair. The artist placed these constellations to remind the community of the 7 sacred Indigenous teachings of love, respect, courage, humility, honesty, wisdom, and truth. Below her womb, she is kneeling in a gesture of humility and reverence, while proudly welcoming the eastern sun on her face. This also represents rebirth, as observed by the medicine wheel. At the base of Ni Mama are Indigenous plantings of sage and burdock for the community to harvest and use in ceremony. Today, during a time when clean drinking water is unavailable to many Indigenous communities, Ni Mama takes on additional activist meaning, challenging us to acknowledge the progress that we have yet to make for our communities regarding natural resources, as well as the colonial destruction that has been caused to many Indigenous communities for the control of water. The next work that I'm going to share with you is Electrical Currents by Julie Nagum, which again deals with water, but in a more contemporary sense, the sense of this, the settler control of water and of land disposition, specifically by Manitoba Hydro. So I'll start off with how Nagum describes her work. She says, quote, "Water is the life force or the essence of Manitoba and the northern section of the province. The northern section of the province specifically is home to some of the strongest and largest hydroelectric developments in North America. In the south, we consume electricity without knowledge of the land that is developed and the predominantly First Nations and Métis communities that are deeply affected. As consumers, we need to continue to work towards sustainable energy consumption, with the overall message that water is sacred and should be consumed and maintained with care." End quote. So Julie Nagum is a Métis, German, and Syrian scholar and artist. She is the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Arts, Collaboration, and Digital Media, and is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Winnipeg. Electrical Currents resembles a large water turbine made from laser-cut welded steel. And there are 2 smaller glass sculptures, and you can see one of them right here, and I've got a close-up in a moment, that are placed on either side of the centerpiece, which balance out this composition. Electrical Currents faces down the downtown Manitoba Hydro building. I read this as a juxtaposition to the Manitoba Hydro's use and effects of water control it's had on Indigenous communities. Not only has Manitoba Hydro moved in, flooded ancestral lands, and taken homes away from Indigenous people in the north, they have also caused many communities to be on a boiled water advisory due to their extractive practices for electrical power. However, Nagum states that this is not meant as a confrontational work, but should be read as a teaching tool, grounded in Indigenous stories of place. She hopes that Electrical Currents will empower communities and kin by inspiring contemplation and dialogue about hydro development. It is without a doubt the work that serves as a reminder of the trauma and violence that has been committed against Indigenous communities in Manitoba for the profits of settler colonial expansion and the manipulation of water. The forged metal and welded turbine is decorated with cutout chevron design symbolizing flowing water and Métis beadwork patterns. For Nagum, this represents kinship and the maps of the lands and the waters. On either side of the turbine are forged metal stands, which hold rock glass cut crystal. They're supposed to resemble a crystal. Each of these glass cut sculptures represent a binary between organic life, sustaining matter, and the industrialized material welded by Western forces. On each of the rocks are Cree pictographs that have been engraved. The imagery was selected by NAGAM to produce image-based narratives about the land and human relationships. A figure with raised hands represents the, and sorry for my pronunciation, Memagwezak, the little people of both the Anishinaabe and Cree worldviews, who live in the rocks and hold spiritual knowledge. In the dark, the rocks and central turbine illuminate, and you can see that in the image there, like beacons, casting shadows of the potent imagery. I argue that electrical currents performs the methodology of story work. These are ancient stories that have been written using image-based narratives to describe what Indigenous peoples want us to remember and learn about each place. Electrical currents is therefore a synergistic conduit to the past, present, and a warning of the future for our land and waters. The next work is Omewandanwan, We Were Told, by Rebecca Barrymore and Osvaldo Hierro. It is a symbol of the failed attempts to assimilate Indigenous people. It is an anti-monument of forced colonial education. For the past 20 years, Barrymore and Hierro have worked collaboratively. They both work as individual artists, but then they come together in a collaborative way as well as RBOY Inc. And they've engaged with materials typically found in nature to relate art to the human body, but here they've done something a little bit different. And here they were inspired to create this sculpture based on their experiences living and working in downtown Winnipeg for 2 years. Barrymore is an interdisciplinary Anishinaabe artist, and Hierro is a Cuban artist concerned with themes that relate to the growing diaspora of Cuba. Owendumawan, when I get nervous for my presentations, I'm always worse at pronouncing things, I'm sorry, is Sultano for We Were Told, and represents Indigenous stories and experiences of self-determined meetings. The sculpture is a stack of 30 weathering steel chairs on top of a concrete plinth. The chairs represent commonly used chairs found at Indigenous gatherings, often stored in church basements, friendship centers, and community halls, and used at band council assemblies, weddings, or powwows. Kathy Matus, a Michif scholar, comments on this work by stating, quote, "In the heart of downtown Winnipeg, people have sat in chairs similar to those, to strategize against systemic racism, to nurture youth, and to partake in cultural practices that were once threatened by assimilation policies. In contemporary times, the concrete table and steel stacked chairs remind how Indigenous people gather to make streets safer. And in the North End, they organize flash mobs in Portage Place Mall in the names of Idle No More, and march the streets of downtown Winnipeg in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls like Tina Fontaine." Barrymore and Hierro described the intent of the piece by explaining, quote, "A symbol of the failed attempts to assimilate us. We were told to be more like them. It is an anti-monument to forced colonial education, and instead it speaks to the knowledge that comes from culture and from tradition. The stack of school chairs on the concrete table is deliberately overturned to signify an ending, finality, like the ivory tower, a paradigm of colonial knowledge that Indigenous communities every day turn on its head. Omewandanwan is a time being told. The time of being told is over," end quote. When I first visited this work, I associated the upturned stack of chairs as a symbolic epitaph for the trauma that residential schools in Canada had forcefully inflicted on our Indigenous communities. I also believed contemporarily that these chairs represented a response to the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which was initiated as a public apology for Canada's residential schools. I was drawn to the additional effect of the weathered steel, which showed corrosive bleeding down the chairs and on the concrete plinth. A bright orange stain, this color is symbolic for residential school awareness, culminated and pooled like bright orange at the base of the sculpture, which continues to grow over time. It was as if this slow drip of corrosion represented what Gerald Visner calls transmotion or survivance of Indigenous peoples, always present, never leaving, and waiting for colonialism to topple over like a stack of chairs. However, though, through research, I learned that Belmore and Yarrow hoped that rather invoking pain, that these chairs would promote strength and resiliency of Indigenous peoples. And quote, the steel material used to make the chairs becomes the infrastructure for the corrosion of colonialism as they rust over time. As a settler, I'm again reminded of my associations with Indigenous works of art and literature that do not have to be acts of trauma or centered around negative impacts of our past, but instead I can shift my lens to see strength, power, celebration, consistency, and focus. So this is just 2 of the 4 works in what's called This Place in Air Canada Park, all of which have a story to tell. Some are connected to the land, while others represent more celebratory traditions, survivance. But all of the works are relevant to the past, present, and the future to replace, make, and remap and reclaim the space. The last work of art that I'm going to share with you today is Roostertown Kettle and Fetching Water. It's a multi-part piece representing the Métis community of Roostertown that was once on site here in the Parker lands and later torched and burnt down by the municipal government to build a shopping mall in the 1950s. So you can find this at what's called Beaumont Station, or the Blue Line, and it was designed by Ian August. It's a multi-part piece, and it's called Roostertown and a Kettle and Fetching Water, and I have some images of different fetching water pieces. It's located on a bike trail, the transit line, and in an open field area. August is a Winnipeg-born Métis artist who often focuses his work on teasing together connections between the layers of histories associated with a site or an object. Roostertown Kettle Fetching Water does just that by bringing to life a storied history of the area and a place that was once called Roostertown. Built along the fringes of the Canadian legal title in suburban Winnipeg, Roostertown was a self-built Métis and non-status First Nations community that was founded in 1901. At its height, it was home to 59 families and approximately 250 people. Many residents of Roostertown were direct descendants of Métis families that had been promised land in the Manitoba Treaty, but were never given it. Like many other Métis settlements in Winnipeg, Roostertown was short-lived due to racism and capitalist control. The community lasted until 1959, like I said, when it was burnt down at the request of Mayor Stephen Juba in order to build Grant Park Plaza. What had once been the largest Métis community in Winnipeg is now one of the many forgotten Métis settlements in Winnipeg. The main element of Roostertown Kettle and Fetching Water is an oversized stainless steel kettle painted to represent the traditional copper kettles with a ceramic blue and white knob. August modeled the kettle after archival imagery of a typical kettle that would have been on every wood stove in Roostertown. He explains that the offering of hot tea with a chance to sit, gossip, tell stories, and visit is the cornerstone of a Métis visit. The intent of contemporary sculpture's size, so the intent of the size of the kettle, was that it would be large enough to actually make and provide boiled water for all 250 people that once lived in Roostertown. I think that's pretty cool. And then we can see these different, they're like flat steel cutout silhouettes of children, particularly fetching water. When I approach the kettle and locate the different children gathering water, I read their presence as ghosts on the landscape, representing complicated memories and layered stories of people and place. Some of these stories are happy, others are sad, but they're everything a family would experience. It's August's hope that Roostertown Kettle and Fetching Water becomes a permanent acknowledgement that a Métis community existed near this site from 1901 to 1959. And that the kettle becomes a symbol of the strong sense of community, generosity, and sharing found in most of all Métis households and communities. So, to conclude, public art from each of these sites represents powerful contemporary markers of storied resiliency and resurgence in Winnipeg. Each work is connected to the land and history of place and of Indigenous survivance in the city. By incorporating the landscape and participation of community, these works are not tokenistic. Instead, they provide a social space to engage and educate the public, memorialize the past, and promote reconciliation for the future. In what the West often refers to as the genus loci, a term that denotes the soul or spirit of a place, these site-specific works have synergized stories through the vessel of public art, proving that Winnipeg, as Owen Taves puts it, is, quote, more than simply a location or a container of Indigenous life. Winnipeg is a place that Indigenous peoples have collectively and strategically decided to remake in order for their families, communities, and nations to survive and thrive in resistance to colonial occupation. Thank you. So I just have 2 pages of references. If you're curious, I can go back to them. It's not a big deal. And then there is a quote at the start that I didn't pause on that I'll go back to. I just like. As part of its commitment to strengthen relationship, honor the past, and build community, established the Indigenous Initiatives Fund. As a grant recipient, the Office of Sustainability set out to explore land-based Indigenous values and create a platform that conveys the understanding and awareness of these values. This presentation takes elements from an online Indigenous story map created with ArcGIS Story Map and focuses on select landscape elements that are currently found along the University of Manitoba riverbank forests. Information about these elements is presented to communicate and demonstrate the land-based values of Indigenous communities while building awareness of Indigenous knowledges, cultures, and traditions. End result, the project aims to create learning opportunities for the university and broader community while addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Specifically, those goals are the Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is reduced inequalities, Sustainable Development Goal 15, life on land, and Sustainable Development Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. To help guide and provide advice on developing an Indigenous story map, the Office of Sustainability developed an Indigenous land-based knowledge working group, whose names you can see here on the screen. This group is comprised of key campus and external stakeholders, with key influence from Elder Stella Blackbird and Elder Audrey Bone. The vegetation in the story map is found along the riparian forest on the Fort Garry campus and was selected by this group as an important species to Indigenous cultures in Manitoba and Canada. This project is dedicated in loving memory of Elder Stella Blackbird, Red Eagle women of the Turtle Clan. The university is truly blessed that she shared her love and knowledge as an elder, medicine teacher, and traditional healer with the community. Elder Stella Blackbird will continue to guide us as her teachings live on. On December 16th, 2019, the Indigenous Land-Based Working Group was invited to meet Elder Stella Blackbird and Elder Audrey Bone in the Circle Room at Magisi-Agamic, Bald Eagle Lodge at the university. During the morning session, tobacco was passed to both elders, Elder Stella Blackbird and Elder Audrey Bone, to hold plant teachings. During this session, they shared the importance of walking in the forest to see the plants, preserve the forest and its plants for future generations, and understand their healing properties and sustainable harvesting methods. A naming ceremony for the project was held in the afternoon. Tobacco was passed to Elder Stella Blackbird and Audrey Bone before the ceremony commenced. The name that came from the spirits was Raven Medicine Cloud, representing winter as it's the raven season, the spreading of seeds, and the clearing of negative energy and sickness to make way of the process of healing. I'm so sorry. After the naming ceremony, a feast was held, including traditional foods such as bison stew, blueberries, and bannock. Small pieces of each food were placed on a plate under a tree to honor the spirits and give thanks for gifting us the name Raven Medicine Cloud. This project holds the responsibility to honor the name of Raven Medicine Cloud through a feast and tobacco offering each winter, which will be held on December 16th of every year. I would like to acknowledge that this presentation is a beginning to demonstrate the land-based values of Indigenous communities while building awareness of Indigenous knowledges, cultures, and traditions at the university. This knowledge was gifted to me, and it is what I will be sharing with you today. These images will be physically displayed at the university in the coming years.
The information below represents only a small portion of many extensive Indigenous teachings that exist. Teachings vary from region and from nation to nation. I highly encourage each of you to reach out and consult with a traditional elder, medicine person, or healer in the appropriate manner to learn more. And the first species that I will be highlighting is wild bergamot. So all these species were selected by the working group. Wild bergamot is a native aromatic perennial among the understory of the riparian forest. Grazers such as deer and rabbits avoid the plant due to its strong minty taste. The spreading of its roots allow the plant to be drought tolerant and provide riverbank stabilization. Medicinal uses such as placing the chewed wad of the plant in the nostrils can relieve the pain of headaches. The entire plant can be applied to the skin to treat cuts and skin abrasions. The plant can be dried for future use. And once it is dried, it can be boiled to obtain the oil to inhale to treat bronchial infections. The leaves and flowers emit a fragrant, minty smell and flavor, which can be used in a tea. Let the same leaves dry and they can be used again to make more tea in the future. Resurgence dogwood is a deciduous shrub that is commonly found in floodplains. The berries are preferred food for songbirds and bears. The dense leaves provide habitat and protection for the goldfinch. The twigs provide browsing material for beavers and rabbits. Other small mammals that include Resurgence dogwood in their diet are squirrels, chipmunks, and raccoons, especially the buds during the winter. The bark of the plant, when used internally or externally, causes the skin to contract to treat skin conditions. Bark shavings can be applied directly on the skin to stop bleeding and prevent infection. The bark, when boiled, can be consumed to treat fevers or for pain relief. Due to its flexibility and durability, the bark can be twisted to create ropes, and the branches used to make the rims of baskets. The fruit can also be used to make a jam or a jelly. Wild red raspberry is a deciduous shrub found along the edge habitat, which is a transition zone between the riparian forest and fields or other open spaces. The fruit is a food source for squirrels, rabbits, deer, moose, and raccoons. The edible fruit and leaves are a rich source of vitamins and minerals. The fruit contains high levels of antioxidants, which promote cardiovascular health. A tea made from the leaves can reduce pain throughout pregnancy and labor. The root of the plant can be used to make a tea for healing sore eyes. The fruit creates a pinkish dye used to color splints for baskets. Fiber from the roots can be boiled and beaten with a mallet to make paper. The fruit can be used to make jam or jelly and may be eaten right off the cane. The fruit can also be dried to preserve and eat at a later date. The leaf of the plant can also be used fresh or dried to make a tea. Stinging nettle is a large native perennial. The plant is covered in small hairs that contain formic acid. When they come in contact with the skin, it can cause an annoying itching or burning sensation. However, the plant is edible and spinach-like in taste. The young leaves of the plant can be boiled and eaten, but cannot be eaten raw because of the stinging hairs. If you pick the plant when it is young, the roots may be eaten, which are high in iron and minerals. It is important to only harvest as much as you need to preserve the plant for future use. The leaves can create a face wash to treat acne and eczema. The root can be boiled to help urinary ailments. A tea can be made from the dried leaves for the formation of hemoglobin due to its high content of iron. Save the strained leaves, dry them, and use the leaves to make more tea. To dry the leaves, tie together and hang upside down, and then place in a jar in a cool, dark place. The roots may be boiled to create a wash to relieve the itching and inflammation caused by touching the stinging leaves. The long fibers gathered from the plant can be used for cord, ropes, and fishing line. Black ash is a deciduous tree commonly found in swampy woodlands from Manitoba to the eastern provinces. The ash population of Manitoba is currently at risk to lose all ash trees over the next 10 years due to emerald ash borer, a highly invasive and destructive insect that has already killed millions of trees in the United States, Ontario, and Quebec. The insect was introduced to North America from China and Eastern Asia and became prominent due to the movement of infested ash trees and materials, particularly firewood. On the Fort Garry campus, approximately 20% of the forest inventory is composed of ash trees. When combined with elm trees, over 40% of the forest inventory is at risk of being lost due to pests and disease. The bark of the plant, when used internally or externally, causes the skin to contract to treat skin conditions. Bark shavings can be applied directly on the skin to stop bleeding and prevent infection. The bark, when boiled, can be consumed to treat fevers or for pain relief. The wood from the tree is used to create baskets. And also, just a side note, Carrie Miller has some beautiful black ash baskets that she's made in her office if you ever do get a chance to see their technological use. Common burdock. The roots can be eaten raw, cooked, or fried. The leaves and stalks can be used as a wild edible salad vegetable. The white pith, where the plant stores nutrients, located in the center of the stem of younger flower stalks, is edible raw. Do not confuse this plant with cocklebur, whose leaves are poisonous. Common burdock is primarily used as a blood purifier and as a remedy for skin diseases and infections. It can be used with other herbs to treat sore throats and colds. The root of the burdock mixed with various ingredients to form a medicine to treat stomach pain. The leaves of the plant can be sewn together and reinforced with birch bark to create a hat for working in the hot summer. And once again, I would like to reiterate that this presentation represents a small sample of traditional knowledges of Indigenous communities to increase the understanding and appreciation for the complexity of traditional land-based knowledge and the associated value systems. For additional resources or to learn more about Indigenous communities on campus, I can recommend the following resources. There's fireside chats, talks on Indigenous knowledges, features traditional teachings, and an opportunity for all to learn from elders and knowledge keepers. The Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series features Indigenous scholars at the university, which allows students, staff, and faculty to learn more about Indigenous perspectives and knowledges. The Cycle Bike Kiosk incorporates the Indigenous planning and design principles, which have been established to guide planning and design on all university lands and campuses. Indigenous artists and alumni Kenneth Lavalley and Dee Barzy were commissioned to create a painting outside the bike kiosk, which you can see in the image in the center. The Permaculture Garden also used the Indigenous planning and design principles through engagement with Indigenous cultural advisors on appropriate ways to integrate Indigenous considerations in the project design. The garden features Indigenous vegetation that I've highlighted in Raven Medicine Cloud. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation houses a collection of Indigenous oral history and documents pertaining to the history and legacy of the residential school system. The Department of Native Studies explores a variety of courses offering an undergraduate program and one of 4 graduate programs in Canada. Cyclical Motion, Indigenous Art and Placemaking, created by the University of Manitoba Campus Planning Office, engaged a team of Winnipeg-based Indigenous artists to develop semi-permanent artworks throughout campus that embody several of the Indigenous planning and design principles. And at this time, I would just like to acknowledge and say thank you once again to Elder Stella Blackbird, Elder Audrey Bone, and the Indigenous Land-Based Working Group, who have generously given their time and expertise to make this project possible. They have consistently guided and supported this project to see its fruition. Thank you to Indigenous Languages Manitoba for sourcing out translators and providing the Indigenous languages for the vegetation that I've highlighted in this presentation today. And if you would like to view the full online story map and the banners, you can follow this link. I'll put it in the chat as well too. But thank you so much.
bioregionalism that we're talking about, it's obviously cultural. So here's a colonial map that obviously is very, development centric. And I don't know how far this goes back. Let me just get rid of this so I can see it. I'm not sure if it says anything down there. You can see what it says. Anyway, it's old. And so it's funny how Shirley was saying yesterday how we don't even realize we have a river there. And so when I looked at a Google scan of the maps of the University of Manitoba, they don't want to embrace the river either. They always seem to cut it off at that eastern section. So here's a typical one, which is obviously going to be very engineering centric, and it's about construction. And unless they're thinking about the fact that the river is federally regulated and that there could be ramifications of their construction activities on there, and there is risk and liability, I think that it should behoove the planners at UManitoba to enlarge the map to give more context to where and how you're dealing with landscape. So I love the fact that we have these design principles, and I really appreciated the fact that I now know more than just 4 R's from environmental management, reduce, reuse, recycle, repurpose. So I'll add this to my vernacular: relationships, responsibility, reciprocity, and respect. Respect came a lot in my handwritten notes. So I appreciated this graphic, but I want to point out that it's a linear model. Engineers love, my colleagues in engineering and some architects love linear models. And I would just suggest that, is that good? Is that bad? Is there an opportunity to modify? So I appreciated Stewart's model, which was circular, non-linear. I believe that it adds to the opportunity to think integratively. And so when Stewart presented this slide, and I've modified it in red, because I think, and it doesn't matter what cultural background you are, I believe that colonial impacts also include capitalistic impacts. And unless you have a green economy set up with equity, you end up having a dysfunctional society. And we have to remember that society is part of nature. It's not beside it. So it needs to be embraced. So in my mind, I think as we sort of navigate through Stewart's circle, the good life was also the past. And so as we sort of reset, we'll end up being in the future, but it'll be the past. And again, I don't think it matters what culture we're talking about. So before I revisited this slide, I was thinking that the design anchor that I had in mind was that you have a temporal walkabout. And it really doesn't matter what end you start at. And the fact that Stewart had this model of geographic time, and you can see that, you can see that that it essentially is a historic. And I even drew a bell curve that was sort of the conflict and the harmony, and the x-axis was time. And so I think that Stewart's upside down bell curve here is essentially how we come back to harmony. And as the previous slides pointed out, the good life. So we heard about the creation stories and the Turtle Island, and so there's context. And so maybe there's an opportunity to meld the creation stories of Indigenous people along with sort of the Western science and the people that deal in prehistoric history. And so Wallace Building, which is really an anchor of this Riverwalk, has the museum, sort of the creation, the beginning of creation. And there's an opportunity, I think, to talk about Western science, Eastern science, and traditional environmental knowledge, all in one space. So I really appreciated the pictures of the native plants. These obviously all have to be dotted along the walkabout. The designers will have to determine whether or not they feel that these plants are sort of to go on their own, or do you cage them in an aesthetically pleasing way, because you'll have rabbit and hare predate, especially the Cornus species in the winter. That could be good because it'll chop down the shrub and you'll get new branching. But if this is supposed to be a destination in the winter, then you obviously want the colorful branches for public consumption. So that's something to consider when you do plant native. It's all part of an ecosystem, and in the winter, as I said, herbivores change their metabolism and eat woody food. I think that there's an opportunity for new friendships, both from the community and the academic side. We have to remember that the Red River goes south. And so maybe there's an opportunity with sister schools, with the University of North Dakota, as long as the same institutions sort of agree on truth and reconciliation principles, that they embrace UNDRIP, the Declaration for and Rights for Indigenous Peoples from the United Nations. So this bioregionalism of the river gives an opportunity for sort of the white man to start to realize that there is connection going back a millennia, and institutions are standing on the places. And so I appreciated that map that was shown this morning. And I think sort of going along the bad aspects of connection of history, there may be nexus points of how the American government oppressed the Indigenous peoples below the colonial border. And those are probably priority opportunities for monuments and for engagement on, like I said, on both sides of the colonial political border. And the river continues on through our city and goes into Lake Winnipeg. So there's already probably very sincere exhibits at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights with respect to indigeneity. But I would suggest that these are the type of opportunities that you have sister sites. It doesn't necessarily need to be run by the Human Rights Museum, but it should be part of it. And it would be lovely, as Shirley was saying yesterday, to have like a bobcat skidoo kind of thing that would make people travel between our riparian walkabout, celebrating Indigenous spirit and history, and go all the way back to the Human Rights Museum. So opportunities for sincere and responsible tourism. I like the fact that there's an opportunity to demonstrate through the Faculty of Engineering microturbine technologies to almost make up for the fact that you don't necessarily have to have mega projects, maybe even giga is a better prefix, in order to supply energy to the south. We may be able to be self-sufficient, as the gentleman alluded to this morning, with structures. And so microturbines, although complex, could be an opportunity for research in the Red River on campus. And will our design embrace the risks that the weather and climate throw at us? Do we try to mitigate by building super strong structures that can handle ice flow and flood, or do we design it so that it ebbs and flows with what nature wants to give? And what nature has wanted to give for millions of years, as long as the Red River has been in existence. It's our imposition onto the landscape that causes our risk. And one thing that I heard at the very beginning of yesterday was we're going to put asphalt path down. So not only is that bad in terms of environmental impact, I would suggest provocatively that it is disrespectful to the Indigenous people of Canada. Asphalt comes out of the tar sands, and there are people that are losing livelihoods, and in some cases even their lives, to the pollution that asphalt is made from. I would encourage the designers and the people that would be involved in this project to think of other materials other than petrochemical based asphalt. And there are frames that aren't as famous in Canada that can help guide. So interestingly enough, Vanessa said, I believe it was Vanessa, that landscape architects always get the shaft at the end of the budget. Oh, sorry, we ran out of money, even though it's usually the landscape architecture that sells the project up front with all the beautiful models and all the flora that is presented. So the landscape architects in the States really got pissed off at that paradigm, and they created this frame called sites. And the civil engineers have created a frame called Envision. And these are all about large scale landscape development and basically a checklist of thinking in an integrative way. And these are my notes, my own little mind map that I can remember. I just ran out of time because it's way too sunny to stay inside anymore. So that's it. So I thank you for letting me share.
This is a poem about trees. Well, it's about imported trees. So I don't know if I didn't see any emmer trees in your list. But and I understand that they're not highly approved of here because they're not very hardy for this landscape. But they are from Siberia, and they are very beautiful. And a few years ago, I was really lucky to be living in a place that had these magical trees in the backyard, and I had many very interesting, magical, visionary experiences with these trees. And eventually I got curious about what kind of trees they were, and I found that they were emmer cherry trees that are from the Emmer River, which is, I had to look it all up. It's the second largest river in the world. It's the border between present-day Russia and China, and it's where the traditional Indigenous people, the Siberian Indigenous people, live along that river. They still have flying tigers and things. So I guess that's where all the magical visionary experiences came from. So so this poem is called Usasa Ammer Trees, and Usasa is the word thank you for the Udigi people, who are the forest people that live along the Ammer River, which is also called the Black Dragon River. Usasa Ammer Trees. Had you not been planted in Mr. M's lilac green apple tiger lilied garden, had he not died in his bed so close by you could have touched him with your quivering leaf tips, but for the invisible glass window between you, had you not begun dying yourselves soon after, sundered from his love and the protection his fragrant hedges offered from the harsh, extreme prairie weather we so fear and admire. Had I not chanced upon the exquisite little white house in that fragrant yard I would soon call my own, had it not been late August and the sun still hot and ever so pleasant in the whispering shade your green leaves made, had I not found the simple red brick fire pit that fit so perfectly between your burnished golden coppery trunks, had we not feasted and sung songs and recited poems under your graceful broad branches around a bright fire all through that lingering fall, had you not come back so spectacularly to bless us for another dozen years with your Siberian magnificence, had you not bleached the chickadees and crows, had you not shown me the astonishing reach of your spirit roots all the way back to the Siberian taiga of your magical birth, along the glittering dark underground river that must have given the Black Dragon its name, had you not taken me to the ceremony of light that the old wise ones make, where the tigers fly and the eagle hunters cry for the whole world's sake, I wouldn't have known that the world tree is every tree and lives also in me, and that the great turning wheel of fire is its crown, and we are all singing and dancing cosmic stars flickering in its gyre up and down.